Hey everybody. This is a piece from a book titled Varieties of Marxism, edited by Shlomo Avineri. It's from 1977. The section that I'm going to be reading is titled Zionist Marxism by Israel Kolatt. Let's see if I can get to this. Duplicate. Let's see, what page am I trying to get to? 227, let's see. Now let's see if there's anything for Israel Kolatt. It looks like he was born in 1927 and died in 2007. Yeah. What was I gonna say? Is there about the authors in this book? It doesn't look like it. Oh well. So here we go. It seems particularly appropriate to devote a lecture to Zionist Marxism in a symposium in memory of George Lichtheim, in whose life Zionism and Marxism met but did not mingle. Wikipedia says George Lichtheim was a German-born intellectual whose work focused on the history and theory of socialism and Marxism. George Lichtheim was the son of the scholar and Zionist activist Richard Lichtheim. George Lichtheim defined himself as a socialist and stated in a 1964 letter to the New York Review of Books that, quote, "I am not a liberal and never have been. I find liberalism almost as boring as communism and have no wish to be drawn into an argument over which of these two antiquated creeds is less likely to advance us any further." His work appeared in the Palestine Post, Commentary, Partisan Review, Dissent, The New Leader, Encounter, Times Literary Supplement, and the New York Review of Books. George Lichtheim also translated Gershom Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. Having moved to London after the Nazis came to power in 1933, George Lichtheim committed suicide in Hampstead in 1973. George Lichtheim's sister was Egyptologist Miriam Lichtheim. His books include The Pattern of World Conflict, 1955, Marxism, 1961, Marxism, A Historical and Critical Study, Marxism in Modern France, The Concept of Ideology and Other Essays, The Origins of Socialism, A Short History of Socialism, Lukács, Imperialism, From Marx to Hegel, Europe in the 20th Century, Thoughts Among the Ruins, Collected Essays on Europe and Beyond. Back to the text. For the past 70 years, Zionist Marxism has played a significant role in shaping the history of the Jewish people. Various Marxist interpretations have been applied to crucial questions, such as the claims to or denial of Jewish nationhood, support or rejection of Zionism, agreement or refusal to cooperate with the diverse groups within Jewry, and the Zionist movement. The attitude of the labor movement in Palestine and Israel towards Marxism and Marxist theoreticians has dictated its internationalist socialist orientation and its position in the Arab-Jewish confrontation, as well as its very organization. However, The great extent of the practical implementation of Marxism in contemporary Jewish history has not been equaled by its purely intellectual achievements. It is difficult to find a single Marxist Zionist ideologist of note, with the exception of Ber Borochov, who flourished at the beginning of this century. Ber Borochov lived from 1881 to 1917 and was a Marxist Zionist and one of the founders of the Labor Zionist movement. Ber Borochov was a pioneer in the study of the Yiddish, the study of the Yiddish language. End footnote. The different versions of Zionist Marxism related to historical and social problems rather than to philosophical expositions. Zionist Marxism confined itself to a few basic formulae, i.e., quote, historical process, quote, historical materialism, quote, surplus value, quote, classes, quote, class struggle, and attempted to apply them to the problem of Jewish existence and to the objectives of Zionism. The theories of Marx and Engels were quoted indiscriminately, along with those of Kautsky, Plekhanov, Lenin, Max Adler, and other popularizers of Marxist ideology. It is only in recent years, after Marxism has lost Marxism's political impact, that attempts have been made at a more thorough philosophical analysis. The conditions of the Jewish people threw the focus of Zionist Marxism onto problems different from those considered vital by European Marxists. Zionist Marxism was not chiefly concerned with the direction of capitalist development, the changes in class struggle entailed thereby, or revolutionary strategy. Zionist Marxism did not even emphasize the class nature of the state. The problem for Zionist Marxists was Jewish existence within the framework of capitalist economy and the class state. The alienation of Jews from the economic and political life of the state appeared to combine both national and class elements. Zionist Marxist discussion proceeded on various levels. One fundamental issue was the ideological significance of nationalism in general and Zionism in particular. Another was the social aspect of Zionism and the social order to which its realization would give rise. Third was the relationship between the objectives of Zionism and the class struggle and world revolution. Russian Marxism penetrated the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century, after striking roots in the Jewish workers' circles and their organization, the Bund. By a historical coincidence, the emergence of the Jewish workers' movement and the establishment of political Zionism came about in the same decade, in the 1890s. The social change which was gathering momentum through the process of industrialization and proletarianization, the intellectual impact of secularization, and the penetration of socialism into Jewish society combined to erode traditional Jewish loyalties. While the socialist theories that reached Jewish society were a mixture of populism and Marxism, their common denominator was the weakening of religious influence, criticism of the particularism of Jewish culture, and emphasis on class interests and universal brotherhood. Zionist socialist thinking at the turn of the century could not therefore base itself a priori on Judaism as a religion or as a culture and historical entity, nor could it regard anti-Semitism as a perpetual and intensifying phenomenon. The exponents of Zionist Marxism had to use new terminology in order to justify and explain Jewish existence in terms of economic progress, class society, and increasing fraternity among the international proletariat. Marxism checked Jewish nationalist aspirations and ideology, yet Marxism also proved able to furnish a basis for Zionism. At the beginning of the 20th century, the specific position of the Jewish people in general and the Jewish proletariat in particular, especially with regard to denial of Jewish rights, was given a Marxist formulation. In addition, Marxism drew attention to the processes and sociological analysis of Jewish reality. The specific and unique nature of the Jewish social reality lent itself to ready formulation in Marxist terms. Zionist Marxism can be characterized by Zionist Marxism's considering the Jewish people as a whole to be its relevant field. Zionist Marxism was not confined to the particular circumstances of Palestine. It sought to define the link between diaspora and homeland in Marxist terms. Section 1. The self-awareness of the Jewish workers' movement was phenomenally influenced by the actual inculcation of Russian Marxist doctrine into the Jewish workers' movement's philosophy in the late 1880s and early 1890s. In Jewish socialism, just as in Russian socialism, Marxist theories were known before their crystallizing into a Marxist doctrine relating particularly to Russia. However, at this stage, Marxism was but one of the available socialist theories, serving as an economic foundation for socialism or as an analysis of the capitalist system, but not as the basis of a separate political organization. Pre-Marxist thinkers were able to state that Russia, owing to Russia's special status, was able to bypass the capitalist stage and pass from traditional rural organization to socialism. Russian Marxism, as formulated by Plekhanov, established certain well-known innovations in Russian political theory. Plekhanov claimed that capitalism was a stage through which Russia could not pass on Russia's own way to socialism. Plekhanov based his theories on the proletariat rather than the peasants, and emphasized the proletariat's political role in effecting a change of regime. On the theoretical plane, Plekhanov replaced the theories of Lavrov and Mikhailovsky with the concept of historical materialism. The Jewish workers should have accepted Russian Marxist doctrine with open arms. It gave importance to the proletariat at a time when the populist Narodnikist philosophy was directed towards the peasants. Indeed, the Marxist doctrine did eventually refer the Jewish intelligentsia to the Jewish workers, who were destined to carry out the revolution. However, the proponents of Marxist doctrine among the Jewish workers' movement ought to have fought hard for the adoption of such a theory. Jewish workers in the early 1890s supported theories drawn from Russian populist thought, such as that of Lavrov, which stressed the advancement of a workers' elite rather than mass organization. In Russia, at the beginning of that decade, this meant Russian education for Jewish workers. The final adoption of Marxism by Jewish workers' movements in Russia around the mid-1890s had many significant effects upon Jewish nationalism. Marxism changed the Jewish labor from an organization of educated workers' groups to a wider range organization, which moved from, quote, propaganda to, quote, agitation, so obliging Marxists to abandon Russian and switch to Yiddish. In addition, the broader-based organizations turned its attention to the conditions distinguishing Jewish worker from his non-Jewish counterpart. The emphasis upon the political deprivation of the rights of the Jewish proletariat led to the creation in 1897 of a separate Jewish workers' organization, the, quote, Bund. As the Bund developed, so grew the demand for Jewish political and cultural autonomy. In one respect, Jewish Marxism in the 1890s led to the emergence of the proletariat as the frontline fighter in the Jewish people's battle for their rights. L. Martov, who was one of the harbingers of the Bund, although he did not join later on, declared in 1895 that only the individual who is prepared to fight for his national rights will be capable of fighting for the rights of his class as well. On the other hand, Marxism, in Marxism's Russian form, maintained an attitude of contempt for the Jewish bourgeoisie, which supposedly would fight neither against the Tsarist regime nor for the national rights of the Jewish people. Marxism gave the Jewish people not only the idea of organizing and directing the proletariat, but also the concept of historical materialism. Historical materialism was supposed to eliminate the basis of Jewish historical continuity, a spiritual succession common to all Jews, a purpose indeed realized among a sizable proportion of the Jewish intelligentsia in Russia, which had joined a revolutionary movement with no Jewish character whatsoever. The Bund did recognize that Jewish uniqueness existed with regard to denial of language rights, Yiddish, and certain character traits and experiences. But Zionist Marxism made historical materialism a basis for Zionism. In the hands of the Zionists, Marxism was transformed into a tool for defining the special economic fate of the Jewish people. Section 2. Zionist Marxism was not a direct continuation of the concept of nationalism, which sprang from the very organization of the Jewish proletariat in the Bund. The Bund understood Jewish nationalism as an autonomy of language and culture. It did not accept the idea of territorial concentration, politically independent or otherwise. In Palestine, nationalism itself seemed to it, at least in theory, more of a fact than a value. Officially, the Bund proclaimed, quote, neutrality with regard to the Jewish national future. Zionist Marxism grew out of the permeation of historical materialist concepts and class struggles into the workers' groups, which aligned themselves with the Zionist organization. Wikipedia says, the World Zionist Organization, or WZO, is a non-governmental organization that promotes Zionism. The World Zionist Organization was founded as the Zionist Organization, which existed between 1897 and 1960 at the initiative of Theodor Herzl at the First Zionist Congress, which took place in August 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. The goals of the Zionist movement were set out in the Basel Program. Operating under the aegis of the WZO are organizations that define themselves as Zionists, such as WIZO, Hadassah, B'nai, Berith, Maccabi, the International Sephardic Federation, the World Union of Jewish Students, WUJS, and more. The Jewish Agency for Israel is a parallel organization with goals, attributes, and leadership closely intertwined with those of the Zionist organization during the years before the establishment of the State of Israel and to varying degrees after that. Significant changes to the statutes of both organizations occurred in 1952, 1970, and 1979. Back to the text. These groups called Poale Zion came into existence at the turn of the century and were first centered in Minsk, White Russia. Let's see if I can figure out how to fucking say this. One second. God damn it.
Poale Zion.
Poale Zion. I don't know, it's probably Pola. I don't know. Well, Poale Zion, meaning, quote, Workers of Zion, was a movement of Marxist Zionist Jewish workers founded in various cities of Poland, Europe, and the Russian Empire at about the turn of the 20th century after the Bund rejected Zionism in 1901. These groups, called Poale Zion, came into existence at the turn of the century and were first centered in Minsk, White Russia. The first such groups were neither theoretically nor practically Marxist, according to the Russian definition. They based their nationalism and socialism on a conglomeration of theories, including Marxism, which suggested a political destiny for the working class, a destiny, however, applied to the Poale Zion to the workers, by the Poale Zion to the workers within the Zionist movement. Opposed to the political Russian Marxism on specifically Jewish grounds, the groups claimed that the national Jewish interest, common to all classes, was to become free and to establish an independent Jewish society. As long as Jews were an oppressed minority, unable to participate in the political revolutionary struggle in Russia, the Jews' class activity in the diaspora could only be economic in nature. The Jews could engage in class struggle only after an independent Jewish center had been established. Marxism indirectly influenced the stand of the Minsk circles with regard to the Zionist movement. Let me repeat that. Marxism indirectly influenced the stand of the Minsk circles with regard to the Zionist movement. The Minsk circles desired democratization of the movement and even envisaged the Jewish proletariats leading the entire nation. Marxism proper entered Poale Zion not as a doctrine per se, but rather made Marxism's entrance as a facet of an actual political topic, the disagreement concerning the, quote, political struggle in Russia, end quote. We have seen that the political content, so characteristic of Russian Marxism, was rejected by the early Poale Zion Minsk groups. Marxism was made acceptable by the stirrings of revolutionary Russia at the beginning of the 20th century and the Kishinev pogrom of spring 1903. Wikipedia says the Kishinev pogrom was an anti-Jewish riot that took place in Kishinev in modern-day Moldova, then the capital of the Bessarabian governorate in the Russian Empire, on the 19th to the 21st of April. During the pogrom, which began on Easter Day, 49 Jews were killed, 92 were gravely injured, a number of Jewish women were raped, over 500 were lightly injured, and 1,500 homes were damaged. American Jews began large-scale organized financial help and assisted in emigration. The incident focused worldwide attention on the persecution of Jews within the Russian Empire and led Theodor Herzl to propose the Uganda scheme as a temporary refuge for the Jews. A second pogrom erupted in the city in October 1905. Back to the text. Some Poale Zion groups differed with the Minsk Center and claimed that even within the diaspora, there is class identification and class struggle of an independent nature, and that these are not bound to any general Jewish political organization, i.e. Zionism. The necessity to relate Zionism to the Jewish class struggle, as well as to that of Russia and the rest of the world, served as a starting point for the development of the various theories of Poale Zion, including those of Ber Borochov. Every theory, Marxism among them, was tested for its response to this integration into the general class struggle. At this point, the older members of the Minsk Circle challenged both the theoretical basis of Marxism in Zionism and the practical results. They claim that Marxism was brought to the Poale Zion movement by, quote, orthodox socialists, decisively dogmatic, whose credo was a perfect faith in the words of Marx. With regard to practical Marxist strategies related to the Russian political revolution, the senior members of the Minsk Poale Zion claimed that these were merely an imitation of the Bund. Actual participation in the Russian Revolution would ultimately sound the death knell for Zionism, in that it would bring about identification with the Russian proletariat and thereby eliminate the consciousness of the individual identity and fate of the Jewish working class. The struggle for the permeation by Marxism of Poale Zion philosophy was indeed a difficult one. According to their opponents, the Bund, it was only in December 1904, at a conference of Southern Poale Zion organizations in Yekaterinoslav, that the formulae of, quote, historical materialism were accepted. Yitzhak ben Zvi, Yitzhak ben Zvi, a former disciple of Borochov and later a leader of Poale Zion in Palestine, explained why Marxism was adopted during a dispute not related to Marxism per se about participation in the political struggle. According to Ben Zvi, the tendency of the intelligentsia to accept the Marxism of the Social Democrats arose from the fact that it was largely urban, whereas the theories of Mikhailovsky and Kropotkin were based more on the village and the interests of agricultural workers. Yitzhak ben Zvi did not see the differences between the Bund and the Poale Zion as being germane to Marxism itself, but rather to its interpretation vis-a-vis the Jewish people. Poale Zion claimed that the Bund placed the Jews in a position inferior to that of other nations. Wikipedia says, Yitzhak ben Zvi lived from 1884 to 1963. Yitzhak ben Zvi was a historian, ethnologist, labor Zionist, leader, and longest-serving president of Israel. Yitzhak ben Zvi was first elected on the 8th of December 1952, assumed office on the 16th of December 1952, and continued to serve in the position until his death. As a scholar, Ben Zvi conducted extensive research on Jewish communities in the land of Israel, including those that existed before the foundation of the modern state of Israel. Ben Zvi preserved oral histories, gathered first-hand accounts and documentary evidence, and published a number of books and articles on the subject. Ben Zvi shed light on their traditions, language, folklore, and religious practices through his work, which frequently focused on the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish as well as the Samaritan communities. The Ben Zvi Institute, Yitzhak ben Zvi, founded and directed, continues to be an important institution for research on Jewish communities in the Middle East. Back to the text. Marxism's primary effect on the Zionist workers' movement was therefore to engender a tendency to participate in the general revolutionary struggle, and its second effect was to base Zionist philosophy upon the concept of, quote, the Zionist philosophy upon the concept of, quote, deproletarization, unquote. Deproletarization expounded and developed the contentions of the Minsk worker circles with regard to the special position of the Jewish worker. Poale Zion created the idea of the, quote, national economy, as opposed to the Bund's notion of international economy, propounded in the social democratic theories of Kautsky. Since the life of each and every member of the nation is in this concept bound up in the national economy, while under the special conditions of the diaspora, in which territory was lacking, minority life and anti-Semitism prevented Jewish workers from entering industry. Such workers were thus doomed to deproletarization. This idea did not originate with Poale Zion. It began with the Bund and with the general Zionist movements. Poale Zion only expanded and subsequently included it in its philosophy. This has been done by Jacob Leszczynski. I can't find anything on this person. This theory led to two possible conclusions: that it was not possible for a Jewish proletariat to be created in the diaspora, thus undermining the very possibility of a proletarian party, and that the establishment of a national economy was necessary and most urgent. The third effect of Marxism was actually a result of the second, i.e., the concept of deproletarization. At the time of the debates on Uganda and territorialism, Marxism was the primary tool for challenging loyalty to the land of Israel. And Wikipedia says the Uganda scheme is a proposal by British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain to create a Jewish homeland in a portion of British East Africa. It was presented at the Sixth World Zionist Congress in Basel in 1903 by Theodor Herzl, the founder of the modern Zionist movement. Theodor Herzl presented it as a temporary refuge for Jews to escape rising anti-Semitism in Europe. The proposal faced opposition from both within the Zionist movement and from the British colony. Back to the text. Zionism was presented as a movement basing itself upon metaphysics or emotion rather than upon historical reality and direct needs of the Jewish proletariat. The inculcation of Marxist philosophy and the concept of Jewish deproletarization were expressed in the, quote, Red Declaration, which, composed by Poale Zion Territorialist SS in 1905, articulated the changes which Marxism had brought about in Zionist socialist circles. It adopted a general socialist position, including the concept of, quote, class struggle, in which it demanded Jewish participation, while on the other hand it contradictorily noted that the absence of a national economy among Jews made a Jewish proletariat impossible. All political thinks with Eretz Israel was renounced in favor of the needs of the Jewish masses and the establishment in any territory possible, even outside of Palestine, of a Jewish economy, which was seen as an expression of, quote, Jewish democracy, while the connection with Eretz Israel was viewed as sentimental and bourgeois, and Eretz Israel just means land of Israel. Yeah. Where am I? A pamphlet published by the Bund opposing the Red Declaration shows clearly the advantages of Marxism in the intellectual atmosphere of Russia at that time during the debates in Zionist circles at this time. It derisively remarked that only in 1904 did the concept of, quote, historical materialism supplant those of, quote, justice and, quote, truth, which had previously reigned supreme in Poale Zion philosophy. Even after the adoption of, quote, historical materialism by Poale Zion, the Bund claimed that, quote, socialist Zionists, end quote, who were in essence territorialists, utilized the concept unfairly. The Bund rejected the concept of a national economy as used by territorialists, Zionists and non-Zionists alike, to explain Jewish inferiority and the Jewish need for territory, and contended that territorialists err in their very definition of, quote, proletarian when they speak of the deproletarization of the Jews. They refer only to the factory workers, while the Marxist concept embraces all those compelled to sell their labor power because of lack of the means of production. Even if there was no great Jewish manufacturing proletariat, there was still a significantly expanding role for all salaried workers. The Bund was not sparing with proofs that Poale Zion was not true either to Poale Zion's claim of supporting historical materialism or to the solidarity of the proletariat, and that it mingled other non-materialistic elements in Poale Zion's philosophy. The Bund indicated particularly that there was a lack of consistency in the theories of Poale Zion. Marxist revolutionary activity did not lead to Zionism or vice versa. The two theories were in fact contradictory. This was obviously one of the more difficult problems which Zionist Marxism had to face. Zionist foreign policy, i.e. contact with the powers, capital P powers, was considered as invalid by the Bund. Instead of a class struggle, Zionists relied upon diplomatic influence or upon the purchase of land with money. The strength of the intellectual and mass influence of Marxism, which affected Poale Zion through the Bund, is evident from the fate of a group which developed into a Jewish Workers' Party, Yiddish Sozialisten, YS. Let's see if anything comes up for that. I don't see anything for it. This party, formed in 1906, practically abandoned Zionism and stressed the struggle for Jewish autonomy in the diaspora. It began with a group of intellectuals, coming chiefly from southern Russia, who challenged what they saw in Zionism as, quote, utopian elements. To base Zionism upon the will, as in Herzl's famous statement, quote, if you will it, it is no dream, end quote, was in direct opposition to its scientific and objective claims, as well as to its wish for an ideology founded in reality. This group changed Herzl's doctrine to, quote, if it is no dream, then desire it, end quote. It wished to display the direct connection between the Jewish diaspora reality and the concentration of Jews in Palestine. In a series of conferences from 1903 on, as well as in various publications, it attempted to set Jewish nationalism and Zionism on a scientific foundation. This search for a basis in real life could have led this group, named, quote, the Revival, to Marxism. However, its system of concepts was variegated. It did not deny Marxism, and in fact used Marxist terminology, but it did not pledge absolute allegiance to Marxism, and there were those within it who with different ideologies. In later publications, two leaders of the, quote, revival, Ben Adir and M. Zilberfarb, asserted that they had not strayed from the path of orthodox Marxism and did not have any ties with the, quote, subjective idealism, end quote, of Lavrov and Mikhailovsky. Let me look up some of these names. Yeah, I'm not finding anything for these people. Wait, where am I? Okay, yeah, I can't find anything for either of these people, neither Benadir nor M. Zilberfarb. Only one of the leaders, M.B. Ratner, had an idealistic view of history and a social revolutionary ideology, and M.B. Ratner's influence was minimal. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for him. Like, I'm saying some things, but they're kind of like, not really telling me anything about their lives or their ideas. The two men admitted, however, that their political strategy tended to base socialism on the class situation not only of the workers, but also in that of the intelligentsia and small-scale farmers, and that they supported the federal concept of a national state. However, Marxism's power was so great that the suspicion of social revolution dug a virtually unbridgeable gulf between this group and the workers themselves. Actually, there were many non-Marxist elements in its philosophy. Borochov, whose differences with it were based not upon a scholastic background of Marxism, but on the real background of, quote, Palestinianism, end quote, or Jewish autonomy in the diaspora, attempted to uncover its principles as non-Marxist, seeing them as vulnerable points for debate. In fact, its position on Marxism was common to those socialists who did not join the Russian SD and regarding political realities. It may be said that during the years 1903 to 1905, Marxism played a rather destructive role in Zionism. It called attention to the revolutionary struggle in Russia, challenged interclass cooperation in Zionism, and even advocated the abandonment of Palestinian Zionism altogether on grounds of territorialism. One second. New section, section 4. The man who transformed Zionism from a deleterious to a constructive factor for Zionism was D.B. Borochov. D.B. Borochov changed the function of Marxist theory for Zionism from a purely destructive force in relation to Palestine-oriented Zionism. Marxism became its ideological justification. The founding of Zionism on Marxism allowed it to be defended in universalist terms and to be judged by a universal socialist criterion. Generations of Zionist socialists used Borochov's philosophy as an intellectual basis for Jewish nationalism and a means for explaining the special position of Jews in the diaspora and their need for territory and a national economy. Zionism, according to the Borochovist doctrine, was not set up outside the domain of the Jewish, Russian, and international class struggles, but became the clearly recognizable expression thereof. The Jewish proletariat was involved directly in general socialism and the revolutionary movement at large. Borochov created a historical picture in which a, quote, spontaneous process, end quote, was taking place that translated the Jewish class struggle into an emigration to and concentration in Palestine. However, the universal basis for Zionism had an opposite meaning as well. Palestinian Zionism was justified because Palestinian Zionism enabled proletarization under national, quote, conditions of production, end quote, or participation in the class struggle. This was liable to become undermined so long as there were other ways of accomplishing those goals, and when it became clear that Zionism is not the best method of class struggle participation. The various movements of revolution in Russia, especially those of 1917, provided a serious challenge to Borochovist Zionism. For many years, up until the 1950s, Borochov's doctrine reflected the ambivalent relationship between Marxism and Zionism, a two-way street which led both towards and away from Zionism and branched into many different directions even within Zionism itself. Borochov's theory had 2 points of departure, one political, the other intellectual. From the political point of view, Borochov's Marxism operated against the Bund, which had denied the need of the Jewish proletariat for the Jewish proletariat's own territory and economy, and claimed that Zionism was utopian and not realizable in the historical framework expressed by the class struggle. But this Marxism also made against the territorialist extreme definition of the deep proletarization of diaspora Jewry and its need for a national economy. Since the territorialist claimed that traditional Palestinian Zionism replaced the real requirements of the masses with an emotional devotion to Eretz Israel, or land of Israel, Borochov had to prove that the attachment to Palestine was not merely sentimental and historical. A third stance which Zionist Marxism attacked was that of the Jewish, autonomist socialists, who sought to create a direct link between the class struggle and the demand for autonomy in the diaspora and the ultimate establishment of a territorial center in Palestine, and who in essence ignored the idea of Palestine. Borochov's theoretical point of departure was that of a Marxism which was rather free with its intellectual content, as borne out by his profound knowledge and by Borochov's tendency to use the term, quote, historical materialism far more than, quote, Marxism, although its political content became increasingly rigid and dogmatic. The political platform of 1906 was indeed one of the stages in his intellectual development. However, the theory underwent dogmatization on being accepted by the party, and the formulations of Borochov from the years 1905 to 1907 became obligatory doctrine within the movement. Defining his philosophical standpoint, Borochov wrote, quote, "The author is a historical materialist, just as Bogdanov is a historical materialist," end quote. Borochov objected to historical materialism, quote, "which is known only through the vulgar speech of the Marxist," end quote, and denied that the basing of history on materialism was equivalent to seeing hedonistic and utilitarian ends as being decisive in history. In one of Borochov's arguments, he claims, quote, "We are not required to become Marxist. However, we have decided to become Marxist because our positive research into the principles of Marxism," end quote. Borochov. In a later period in 1907, Borochov explained Marxism not only as a theory but as the basis for a party. Parties which are clearly Marxist were those, quote, "which recognize the historical materialistic view of society and the Marxist analysis of capitalistic economy and its development," end quote. In accordance with accepted Marxist views, Borochov connected this recognition with the class definition of hired laborers as a separate class. As this definition became clearer, he held, idealistic philosophy was neglected and materialistic philosophy adopted. The question of a place for Marxism within the self-definition of Poale Zion concerned Borochov when he stayed in the United States in 1915 and participated in the debates among the various ideological factions there. At the same time, Borochov distinguished 2 basic ideological trends within Poale Zionism, quote, socialist and, quote, social democratic. The socialist demanded realization of Zionism and socialism through national unity. The latter, social democratic, was defined in accepted Russian terminology as one which did not discount the class struggle with the process of realization of Zionism and socialism or cover it up with national unity. Quote, Marxism, at that time, was thought by Borochov to be a philosophical rather than political trend. Marxism stood on the same level as, quote, materialism, quote, Kantianism, or, quote, critical empiricism. Borochov declared himself to be a, quote, critical empiricist, end quote, neither materialistic nor idealistic, who opposed any kind of metaphysics, quote, a Marxist without matter, end quote, in his terminology. According to Borochov, the, quote, social democratic, end quote, outlook allowed for different approaches to the future socialist regime, collectivistic and anarchistic alike. He defined himself personally as a socialist anarchist. In 1905, Borochov joined the criticism of Zionism by the territorialist Marxists. Borochov also opposed the basing of Palestinian Zionism on, quote, eternal spiritual essence, end quote, the Jewish spirit, or race, geography, or historical individuality, describing his credo as follows, quote, the content of the social ideal should be drawn from the material conditions of the particular society and not from the remnants of a past ideology, end quote. Borochov. In Borochov's debates with non-Marxists and Poale Zion, Borochov negated the independent position of a, quote, national culture, or, quote, tradition, which is faced by the individual. Borochov saw these concepts as remnants of a populistic outlook, and himself rooted Borochov's nationalism in territory as a, quote, condition of production. Territory is the common means for material living among all classes. Borochov objected to concepts such as, quote, the content of national existence, or, quote, the goals of national development, which were oppressed by the, quote, form of a foreign economy, capitalism, or a foreign state. The meaningful content of nationalism is territory as a basis for a national economy, from which political autonomy follows, political unity being simply a protective device. The inclinations of the various classes towards the nation are merely inclinations towards the national territory. Feelings of sacrifice and tradition are only secondary. Borochov's nationalism did not relate particularly to the Jewish people. Borochov's nationalism was a general nationalist doctrine which attempted to explain nationalism on the basis of concepts inherent in historical materialism. Borochov claimed that to the Marxist terms, quote, forces of production, and, quote, relations of production, which explain the existence of classes and their struggle, one should add, quote, conditions of production, parenthesis, territory, and parenthesis, end quote, which are common to all classes. Borochov indicated that from a historical point of view, nationalism is a relative phenomenon supported by the bourgeoisie. In the first stage of Borochov's political theory, from 1904 to 1905, Borochov defined Zionism as a, quote, therapeutic and not a, quote, normal movement. That is, Zionism creates the preconditions for the Jewish class struggle, but does not itself express this struggle. The movement combines three factors: people, land, and national culture, which cannot be eliminated or reduced to one another, and is not realized by the proletariat, but by pioneers who are pioneers for the entire nation and not members of a particular class. At the second stage of development, 1905 to 1906, the class outlook was sharpened with respect to both the content of nationalism and the realization of Zionism. The sharper view came about through the debates among socialist trends within the Jewish community, among nationalists and non-nationalists alike. Borochov's national and Palestinian Zionist theories were presented as the most consistent conclusion to be drawn from historical materialism and the class struggle. Borochov objected to the idea of deproletarization of diaspora Jewry, claiming that proletarization exists, although suppressed and handicapped, in a form leading to the unique Jewish class struggle, which both involves the Jews in the world revolutionary struggle and propels them to Palestine. I want to look up more on Borochov. Ber Borochov. See if there's anything more in his biography. Yeah, so I'm going to read up a bit about Ber Borochov. Dov Ber Borochov lived from 1881 to 1917. Ber Borochov was a Marxist Zionist and one of the founders of the Labor Zionist movement. Ber Borochov was also a pioneer in the study of the Yiddish language. Dov Ber Borochov was born in the town of Zolotonosha, Russian Empire, now in Ukraine, and grew up in nearby Poltava. Ber Borochov's mother and father were both teachers. As an adult, Ber Borochov joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but was expelled when Ber Borochov formed a Zionist Socialist Workers Union in Yekaterinoslav. After being arrested by the Russian authorities, Ber Borochov left for the United States. Subsequently, Ber Borochov helped form the Poale Zion. Like I said, I don't know how to pronounce that word. Workers of Zion Party, and devoted his life to promoting the party in Russia, Europe, and America. When the Russian Social Democrats came to power, Borochov returned to Russia in March 1917 to lead the Poale Zion. Ber Borochov became ill and died in Kyiv of pneumonia in December 1917. Ideology. Borochov became highly influential in the Zionist movement because Ber Borochov explained nationalism in general and Jewish nationalism in particular in terms of Marxist class struggle and dialectical materialism. Ber Borochov saw himself as a Marxist, and he laid out his philosophy in his first major work, published in 1905, The National Question and the Class Struggle, in which Borochov criticized capitalism. In November 1905, Ber Borochov joined and soon became a leader of the Poale Zion movement, drafting in 1906, quote, Our Platform, the manifesto of the movement. In Our Platform, Ber Borochov attempted to answer the questions, quote, what is the Jewish national question, end quote, and, quote, what is its meaning for the Jewish working class, and how does it propose to solve it, end quote. Wait, there's a picture of him here. It's like, this is a very handsome man if this is actually a picture of him. I don't know. Anyway. Yeah, I think it's him. Looks kind of modern. I don't know. That's weird. Anyway. Ber Borochov predicted that nationalist forces would become more important in determining events than economic and class considerations, especially as concerned the Jews. Borochov argued that the class structure of European Jews resembled an inverted class pyramid where few Jews occupied the productive layers of society as workers. The Jews would migrate from country to country as the Jews were forced out of their chosen professions by, quote, a, quote, Stichic process, end quote, which would ultimately force migration to Palestine, where they would form a proletarian basis in order to carry out Marxist class struggle. Ber Borochov became an avid supporter of Palestine-based Zionism, following the Sixth World Zionist Congress, during which the question of Uganda as a possible temporary refuge for the Jews was debated. A key part of Borochovian ideology was that the Arab and Jewish working classes had a common proletarian interest and would participate in the class struggle together once Jews had migrated to Palestine. In Borochov's last recorded speech, Borochov said, quote, Many point out the obstacles which we encounter in our colonization work. Some say that the Turkish law hinders our work. Others contend that Palestine is insignificantly small, and still others charge us with the odious crime of wishing to oppress and expel the Arabs from Palestine. ... When the wastelands are prepared for colonization, when modern technique is introduced, and when the other obstacles are removed, there will be sufficient land to accommodate both the Jews and the Arabs. Normal relations between the Jews and Arabs will and must prevail. End quote. Ber Borochov. However, in previous writings, Borochov imagined that the Arab inhabitants of Palestine would disappear through assimilation with the economically and culturally more advanced European settlers. In the long run, Borochov predicted that, quote, the inhabitants of Eretz Israel will adapt themselves to the economic and cultural type that seizes a dominant economic position in the country. The natives of Eretz Israel will assimilate economically and culturally with whoever brings order to the country, whoever undertakes the development of the forces of production of the land of Israel, end quote. Borochov's conclusion, quote, it is the Jewish immigrants who will undertake the development of the forces of production of the land of Israel, and the local population of Eretz Israel will soon assimilate economically and culturally to the Jews, end quote. Describing the Arab population of Palestine as living under primitive standards of civilization and economics, Borochov asserted that Jewish immigration will bring, quote, progressive methods of labor, a higher standard of living, and a higher scale of wages, end quote. Ber Borochov, along with Nachman Sirkin, is considered a father of socialist Zionism, citation needed. Borochov's ideas were influential in convincing Jewish youth from Europe to move to Palestine. Citation needed. However, Borochov's theories remained most influential in Eastern Europe, where Borochov's ideas formed the basis of the left Poale Zion movement, which was active in Poland during the interwar years. Citation needed. Indeed, Borochov's vision of class struggle in Palestine was widely viewed as untenable by the 1910s, with Jewish migrants to Palestine struggling to establish an economic foothold and with interclass cooperation seemingly necessary, and his theories dimmed in popularity there. Citation needed. Borochov, for years an advocate for a doctrinaire Marxist Zionism, himself seemed to repudiate his former vision of class struggle in Palestine in speeches towards the end of his life. Citation needed. Borochov insisted that Borochov was a social democrat, but Borochov's left Poale Zion followers continued to vigorously advocate class struggle both in Palestine and Eastern Europe, supporting the February Revolution of 1917. Borochov returned to Russia in August 1917 and attended the Third All-Russian Poale Zion Party Congress to argue for socialist settlement in Palestine. The Poale Zion Conference selected Borochov as a delegate to the Conference of Nationalities, where Borochov issued a paper describing Russia as a decentralized socialist commonwealth of nations. Borochov caught pneumonia while on a speaking tour and died in Kyiv on the 17th of December 1917 at the age of 36. Russian Poale Zion movement split into two factions over attitudes towards the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. The Poale Zion left formed the Borochov Brigade to join the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and ultimately split from the main Poale Zion party to become the Jewish Communist Party in 1919, and would go on to join the Jewish section Yevsektsiya of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, while the Social Democratic Right Poale Zion was banned. After Borochov's death in December 1917, Borochov was buried in the Lukyanovka Jewish cemetery in Babi Yar near Kyiv. In 1954, a process to reinter the remains of notable leaders of Russian Zionism to Israel was initiated by the Association of Russian Immigrants to Israel. With the intervention of Israel's second president, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, who had been a friend of Borochov's remains were finally brought to Israel and buried in the Kinneret Cemetery alongside many other socialist pioneers on the 3rd of April 1963, citation needed. The international Poale Zion movement also split into left and right factions, which evolved especially into the modern Israeli political parties of the leftists Mapam, later Meretz, and the non-Marxist party of Ben-Gurion, Mapai, the precursor of the Israeli Labor Party. The European branch of the left Poale Zion movement was effectively destroyed by the early 1950s. Many of its members were killed by the Nazis during World War II, and the surviving activists were persecuted and ultimately outlawed under the various post-war communist regimes of Eastern Europe. While most Zionists regard Yiddish as a derivative language characteristic of the Jewish diaspora and to be abandoned by the Jewish people in favor of Hebrew, Borochov was a committed Yiddishist and Yiddish philologist, and Borochov wrote extensively on the importance of Yiddish. Borochov wrote a short dictionary of Old Yiddish and was a regular contributor to the Yiddish daily newspaper, Die Wahrheit. Although Borochov only began to study Yiddish at the age of 26, Ber Borochov is considered the founder of modern Yiddish studies. Borochov's contributions were recognized in various ways by the early Jewish settlement in Palestine. For example, the first workers' neighborhood in the country, in what later became the city of Kyiv Atayim, was named after Borochov. And the next piece is the other. I wanted to also read the never mind. The Zionist Socialist Workers Party, often referred to simply as Zionist Socialists or SS by their Russian initials, was a Jewish territorialist and socialist political party in the Russian Empire and Poland that emerged from the Vozrojdeni Renaissance group in 1904. The Zionist Socialist Workers Party held its founding conference in Odessa in 1905. In the same year, the party sent delegates, among them Nachman Sirkin, to the Basel 7th Zionist Congress. However, while the mainstream Zionist movement rejected the idea of a Jewish state anywhere but in Eretz Israel, the Russian party favored the idea of a Jewish territorial autonomy outside of Palestine. Moreover, while territorial autonomy was the goal of the party, it dedicated most of its energy into revolutionary activities in Russia. Like other Russian revolutionary groups such as the Narodniks, the party was positive towards using terrorism as a means of struggle against the establishment. Nachman Sirkin, Jacob Leszczynski, Wolf Latsky Bartoldi, Shmuel Niger were among the leading figures of the party. The party played an active role in the 1905 revolution. At the 7th Congress of the World Zionist Organization in 1905, the Zionist Socialist Workers Party rejected the Uganda Plan, a proposal to resettle Jews in East Africa, after sharp debates. The Zionist Socialist Workers Party fell on the side of supporting Theodor Herzl and the plan itself. In response, the party and other territorialists withdrew from the... At the 7th Congress of the World Zionist Organization in 1905, the World Zionist Organization formally rejected the Uganda Plan, a proposal to resettle Jews in East Africa, after sharp debates. The territory fell on the side of supporting Theodor Herzl and the plan itself. In response, the Zionist Socialist Workers Party and other territorialists withdrew from the World Zionist Organization. The Zionist Socialist Workers Party grew rapidly and became the second largest Jewish labor party after the Bund. The Zionist Socialist Workers Party organized the, quote, neutral trade unions in opposition to the Bundesunions. In the end of 1906, the Zionist Socialist Workers Party claimed a membership of 27,000. However, after 1906, the influence of the party began to decline sharply. Many leaders went into exile in Western Europe. The central organ of the party was the weekly Yiddish newspaper Der Neurfig, published from Vilna, 1906 to 1907. The newspaper was closed down by the authorities in 1907. During the 1907 Stuttgart Congress of the Second International, the International Socialist Bureau decided to give a consultative role to the Zionist Socialist Workers' Party at the Congress. The decision was, however, overturned a year later. In 1911, the Zionist Socialist Workers' Party, the Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, and Poale Zion signed a joint appeal to the International Socialist Bureau, asking the International to recognize the national character of the Jewish people. In 1917, the party merged with the Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, forming the United Jewish Socialist Workers' Party. Okay, back to the text. Sorry about that. At this stage, nationalism was shown to be of interest in that nationalism laid down the conditions for the national Jewish proletariat. It was put in a radical class formulation. Quote, "The national question of the proletariat is the product of the conflict between the need for developing its creative powers, i.e. the class struggle, and the conditions of the strategic base." End quote. The primary reason for the troubled state of the Jewish people was no longer its exterritorialism, but the class structure of society. Thus, when private property and a class society disappear from the world, the problem of nationalism may vanish as well. Borochov wanted to show that Zionism is the highest level in the consciousness of the Jewish worker. Using the accepted scale of the Russian social democracy, Borochov defined the position of the Bund as, quote, economism, while proletarian Zionism was an expression of political social consciousness, which viewed the problem in the problem's broadest scope. Borochov's explanation of anti-Semitism was also nationalistic and class-related, in terms of a, quote, national rivalry among the parallel classes of different nations occupying the same territory, so that a rivalry may exist between the Jewish proletariat and that of other nations. Borochov explained the attachment to Palestine, and not just the need for territory, through historical materialism. By analysis of the trends toward both Jewish emigration and the development of colonial areas, Borochov tried to show that Palestine is the most suitable place for establishing a Jewish society based on concentration of the Jewish people. The attachment to the land of Israel is, quote, prognostic, and not, quote, principle, is based, that is to say, on the historical process and not on eternal values. The flow of Jewish capital and emigration of labor to Palestine created a Jewish capitalistic economy. The task of building up an economy is for the bourgeoisie, while that of the proletariat is obtaining political and economic freedom. The doctrine of Borochov strengthened the territorial and economic elements of Jewish socialist nationalism and the development of a Jewish labor movement in Palestine. Thus, the essence of national existence, which was based on historical materialism, was not necessarily expressed primarily through sovereignty or tradition and culture, but through territory and economy. This was to have political consequences in the future. The stage in Borochov's thought of radical class explanation was the one particularly adopted by Borochov's movement. In 1909, the Russian Poale Zion left the Zionist Congress, refusing to cooperate with the, quote, bourgeois Zionists, end quote. Borochov's Marxist thought was not necessarily called from Russian Marxism. Borochov's education and intellectual abilities enabled Borochov to absorb European Marxism directly. Borochov's position on the question of nationalism was even in opposition to the Russian Marxist view at that time. To some extent, it colored Ukrainian nationalist thought, and Borochov was indeed close to the Ukrainian nationalist movement in 1917. Stalin's 1913 nationalist theory contained principles similar to Borochov's, although it would seem that there was no direct influence. However, there is an indirect connection between Borochov's position on several Zionist topics and the problems which concerned Russian Marxism, that of the relation between the spontaneous process, which nurtured the revolutionary forces, and conscious action became expressed in Russian Marxism as the relation between the development of capitalism and the working class on the one hand, and revolutionary action on the other. Within the Zionist field, this was the question of the relation between the plight of diaspora Jews and emigration to Palestine. The Poale Zion party was faced with the dilemma of how far to go in encouraging emigration of its members and the Jewish proletariat to Palestine, and to what extent merely to stand at the forefront of the process and guide it. Russian Marxism even considered the questions of the relation between the two revolutions, the bourgeois and the socialist, and the amount of cooperation necessary and or desirable between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Similar problems were raised in the Zionist field as regards the justification of cooperation among different classes in the Zionist movement in order to realize the aims of Zionism. The third topic, which greatly concerned Russian Marxism, was connected with the first two. The argument between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks on whether to have a broad spectrum or an elitist party did not directly concern Poale Zion. However, at the time of these debates on the Duma, Borochov indicated his own attitude and hence implied his views as to the Poale Zion party. In an article of 1907, before the dissolution of the Second Duma, Borochov assessed Bolsheviks as a group which desired to set the revolution in motion in a technical manner before spontaneous historical development had paved the way for it. On the other hand, Borochov saw the Mensheviks as the artificial organizers of the proletariat even before its class organization had come about through spontaneous historical processes. From this we see that Borochov's own party, Poale Zion, was, in Borochov's opinion, one which advanced, led, and organized the spontaneous development of the Jewish proletariat. It could be said that Russian Marxism had a deleterious influence on the Russian Poale Zion, whose followers became the Palestinian Poale Zion during the first few years of operation there. One second. I don't see anything. It could be said that Russian Marxism had a deleterious influence on the Russian Poale Zion, whose followers became the Palestinian Poale Zion during the first few years of their operation there, in that it confined the role of the party to the class struggle and the taking over of the political regime. Indeed, options for political activities were closed to them, while they had to prove their capacity in the field of economic activity, since the spontaneous process did not provide jobs and, quote, class struggle, end quote, was meaningless. Section 5. Borochovist Marxism was not the only brand prevalent in Poale Zion circles. In addition to the Russian party, influenced by Borochov, and the Palestinian party, similarly influenced during its few years of existence, there was also the Austrian party, which contained one outstanding proponent of a different brand of Marxism, Shlomo Kaplansky. Okay, I'm going to read Shlomo Kaplansky's Wikipedia page real quick. Shlomo Kaplansky lived from 1884 to 1950. Shlomo Kaplansky was a Labor Zionist politician who served as the secretary of the World Union of Poale Zion. During the 1920s, Shlomo Kaplansky was leading advocate of a binational state in Palestine. Kaplansky was the president of the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. Shlomo Kaplansky was one of the founders of Poale Zion, a Marxist Jewish group. Kaplansky was a Poale Zion delegate to the 10th Zionist Congress in Basel, August 1911, in which Shlomo Kaplansky raised the question of relations with the Arabs and advocated explaining to them the benefits that the Zionist enterprise could bring them. In June 1914, Shlomo Kaplansky argued that sharecroppers being evicted following Zionist land purchases should be given land outside Palestine. Shlomo Kaplansky was profoundly shaken by the First World War, which led to Shlomo Kaplansky's opposition to notions of armed conflict in Palestine, and Shlomo Kaplansky hoped for the realization of Zionism by peaceful means. In 1919, Shlomo Kaplansky envisioned that, quote, both people in this country, Jews and Arabs, are guaranteed national autonomy on a personal basis and will enjoy national equity of rights in municipalities and local governments, end quote. And that, quote, the national languages of Jews and Arabs will enjoy equal status, end quote. Shlomo Kaplansky became head of the World Union of Poale Zion in Vienna, and in the summer of 1920, Shlomo Kaplansky and David Ben-Gurion were sent to set up a Poale Zion office in London. The office was in rooms in Petticoat Lane, with Moshe Sheret working part-time translating Yiddish into English. Ben-Gurion and Kaplansky succeeded in becoming affiliated to the British Labour Party, and under the name of the, quote, Jewish Socialist Labour Party, claiming membership of 3,000, although actual membership was then a few hundred. One issue that they tried to influence policy on was the northern border of Palestine, which was being decided at the San Remo Conference. They hoped that it would be extended as far as the Litani River. They had only limited success in influencing Labour Party Middle East policy, and the office closed in March 1921. Along with David Ben-Gurion, Shlomo Kaplansky had contacts with both Labor and the Independent Labour Party. Shlomo Kaplansky collaborated with the Independent Labour Party in setting up the Vienna International. In Palestine, Shlomo Kaplansky became a member of Adut HaAvoda and attended their third Congress held at Ein Herod in May 1924. At the time, the British Mandate authorities were proposing the setting up of a legislative council. Kaplansky was in favor of supporting the initiative. Quote, we should come to an agreement with the Arabs and together demand the expansion of the parliament's jurisdiction and ultimate self-rule, end quote. Shlomo Kaplansky proposed two assemblies, one of elected representatives which would inevitably have an Arab majority, the second would have equal numbers of Jews and Arabs. Shlomo Kaplansky called for cooperation with the Arabs without British supervision and for the establishment of settlements all over the country with the vision of a binational state. Ben-Gurion was strongly opposed to these proposals, which he called, quote, Kaplansky's error. Ben-Gurion opposed negotiations with Arabs since their leadership was from the, quote, Effendi ruling class and called for the development of ties with an Arab working class. Ben-Gurion wanted the separation of the two people, Arab and Jew, under British supervision with Jewish settlements and concentrations as a prelude to a Jewish state. The Congress rejected Kaplansky's proposals. 5 years later, Ben-Gurion reversed his position on federal institutions, and in 1936, Ben-Gurion accepted the idea of negotiations with Effendis. In 1925, Kaplansky was director of the Zionist Organization Settlement Department in Jerusalem. In 1927, Ben-Gurion called for his resignation as the Adut HaAvoda representative on the Zionist executive over the way relief was being distributed to unemployed Jews. The resignation call was rejected by the Histadrut, but Kaplansky did resign later in the year, following the Zionist Congress in Basel, September 1927. Shlomo Kaplansky was appointed chairman of the Histadrut Economic Committee, Histadrut being like the trade union of Israel. During the 1928 discussion between Poale Hatzair and Adut HaAvoda, which led to the formation of Mapai, he threatened to resign because of the manifesto was not socialist enough. In 1929, Kaplansky returned to the Zionist executive and was a member of the delegation from Palestine to the Jewish Labor Congress held in Berlin, 27th of September 1929. Kaplansky was appointed as the president and director of Technion in 1931, a position Kaplansky held until 1950. Under Kaplansky's leadership, Technion was developed into a technological university of Central European type. He was preceded by Joseph Breuer and succeeded by Yakov Doherty. The 21st Zionist Congress held in Geneva, August 1939, appointed Shlomo Kaplansky as head of the Committee of Inquiry into Arab-Jewish Relations, which reported to a conference convened in Palestine by Chaim Weizmann in 1945. In May 1942, Shlomo Kaplansky presided over a special conference which led to the formation of the, quote, V-League to help the Soviet Union, end quote, which raised funds for the Soviet war effort. Back to the text. Despite Shlomo Kaplansky's Russian origins, Shlomo Kaplansky was greatly influenced by both German revisionist Marxism and Austrian Marxism. Shlomo Kaplansky was less dogmatic than the Russian Marxist in the philosophical sense, and less rigid in his devotion to class activity. Shlomo Kaplansky's Marxism was fundamentally less monistic than Borochov's and supported interclass cooperation and constructive economic activity. For Kaplansky, the nation was established not on material bases alone, but also on the appeal to the common will, as described by Fichte and Lassalle. Kaplansky's position on nationality was profoundly colored by Austrian socialism. Kaplansky did not necessarily found his nationalism on territory, but stressed the abnormalcy of the Jewish economy and proletariat, which was hurt more than any other class by anti-Semitism and the lack of territory. According to Shlomo Kaplansky, the proletariat was not intended merely to become integrated into the spontaneous economic progress, nor to show its initiative only at the stage of political revolution. Rather, the proletariat ought to lead the Jewish people and the Zionist movement through the first step as well, that of economic construction. Consequently, Zionism as portrayed by Shlomo Kaplansky was the movement of the Jewish proletariat, which required neither charter nor legal rights, as Herzl had believed, in order to emigrate to Palestine, and since the stream of private investment of capital could not create enough work, a cooperative settlement might provide jobs for immigrating workers. Such a settlement would present Zionism as a proletarian movement, and would thereby create cells for a future socialist society. This interest of the proletariat, to emigrate and settle collectively, would be realized through interclass cooperation within the Zionist movement, a concept especially important with regard to Palestine activity. In the diaspora, the Austrian Poale Zion was in the forefront of the battle for a Jewish national identity and autonomy, which also insisted upon a local Jewish class struggle. Kaplansky's thought was thus essentially Marxist. Zionism for Kaplansky was not a political or spiritual longing. Zionism was anchored in economic development and national and international class relations. National and international class relations. The difference of opinion on Marxism and Marxism's relevant conclusions among the various Poale Zion parties did not prevent their establishment in 1907 of a world union. The party's cooperative efforts in Zionism and in operations in Palestine and attempts to gain acceptance into the Socialist International were far more important than doctrine. An even greater influence was the belief in the proletariat as the expression of the spontaneous process, which increased the desire for unity, on the assumption that the very act of unification would bring about acceptance of the doctrine. Indeed, the Articles of the World Federation of Poale Zion speak of the hope of ending the rule of the property holders through, quote, class struggle, both economic and political, by the working class, end quote. In reality, there were parties whose members objected to historical materialism and viewed the realization of socialist Zionism as the result of national activity and moral influence rather than class struggle. This view was held especially by the American Party and its mentor, Nachman Syrkin. I'm going to read the Wikipedia for Nachman Syrkin real quick. Nachman Syrkin was a political theorist, founder of Labor Zionism, and a prolific writer in the Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, German, and English languages. Nachman Syrkin was born to a Lithuanian Jewish family in Mogilev, Russian Empire, now Belarus. Nachman Syrkin was influenced by Poale Zion and socialism in Nachman Syrkin's youth, and dedicated himself to synthesizing the two concepts. In this task, Nachman Syrkin was joined by Ber Borochov. Syrkin's daughter, Mary, was a noted writer, educator, and American Zionist activist. Nachman Syrkin was one of the leaders of the Socialist Zionist faction of the First Zionist Congress in 1897, and was an early proponent of the Jewish National Fund. Nachman Syrkin was also the first person to propose that Olim to Palestine form collective settlements. Unlike other socialist thinkers of the time, Nachman Syrkin was comfortable with his Jewish heritage, and although Nachman Syrkin does not spell it out explicitly in his essay, The Jewish Question and the Jewish Socialist State, published in 1898, it is clear that Nachman Syrkin had in mind the biblical emphasis on strict social justice, irrespective of wealth, power, or privilege. However, Nachman Syrkin saw Zionism as a replacement for traditional Judaism. Quote, the new Zionist Judaism stands in complete contrast to the Judaism of exile, ... Zionism uproots religious Judaism in a stronger way than reform or assimilation by creating new standards of, quote, Judaism, which will constitute a new ideology that can be elevated to the status of a religion, end quote. Nachman Syrkin. In the article, The Jewish Question and the Socialist Jewish State, Nachman Syrkin sought to reconcile his conception of socialism and his strong devotion to Zionism, arguing against what Nachman Syrkin considered bourgeois Zionists such as Theodor Herzl, that only the Jewish working class could realize Zionism. Nachman Syrkin also argued against anti-Zionist Jewish socialists that there could be no solution to the Jewish problem without the creation of a Jewish state. Nachman Syrkin worked to establish socialist Zionist groups throughout Central Europe. After studying and working in Germany and France, after being banned from Germany in 1904, Nachman Syrkin returned to Russia after the Russian Revolution of 1905. Nachman Syrkin took part at the 1905 Basel 7th Zionist Congress as a delegate of the new Zionist Socialist Workers Party. In 1919, Nachman Syrkin was a member of the American Jewish delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference. Nachman Syrkin was also a leading figure in the World Poale Zion Conference that year and was given the task of visiting Palestine to develop a plan for kibbutz settlement. Nachman Syrkin intended to relocate to Palestine but died of a heart attack in 1924 in New York. In 1951, Nachman Syrkin's remains were buried in the kibbutz Kinneret beside the other founders of Labor Zionism. Kfar Syrkin, founded in 1933 close to Petah Tikva, is named for Nachman Syrkin. Back to the text. The test for the various theories in Poale Zion was the Palestinian Party, which was at first influenced by Borochov and envisaged a great flow of Jewish capital to Palestine as a result of the spontaneous process of class interest and class struggle. The capital was to initiate the development process of the Jewish and Arab settlements alike, establish a Jewish working class, and make possible the class struggle which would lead to a socialist society. However, even in the years before 1906, It became clear that Borochov's forecasts were not borne out by reality, and that Jewish capital was not streaming to Palestine. It appeared that the Russian Marxist and Borochovist models were not suitable for Palestinian conditions. The revolution of the Young Turks in 1908 aroused hopes for some sort of socialist political action within the Ottoman Empire. The content of this socialist action was taken to be primarily the attainment of national autonomy. The Poale Zion party in Palestine found that the class struggle against the small and unstable Jewish private property in Palestine was meaningless and took off in another direction. It turned to the establishing of workers at places of employment and to joining with the Zionist movement in founding cooperative settlements. Immigration to Palestine was no longer considered as owing solely to economic and class-related reasons, but as requiring a conscious voluntary effort. The party began to see itself less in terms of global processes and instead emphasized the particular needs of the Palestinian Jewish proletariat, which were so pressing that direct interests and reality took preference over Marxist theory. Under Borochov's leadership, Orthodox Marxists objected both to interclass cooperation within the Zionist movement and to cooperative institutions. The Austrians, Americans, and Palestinians, however, did not think this cooperation impugned the class socialism of Poale Zion. Borochov's free attitude towards theoretical Marxist doctrine, as well as Borochov's orthodoxy regarding class struggle as a way of realizing socialism and Zionism together, were expressed in the renewed debates on the attitude towards cooperation at the Fourth International Convention of the United Poale Zion Parties in 1913. Speaking about the theoretical side of Marxism, Borochov said, quote, "It is a great mistake to claim that Marxism recognizes only that which was written by Marx himself. Our attitude towards the question of nationalism is different from Marx's. Marxism gives us only the standards by which we assess ourselves in the events and phenomena of social life." End quote. The actual explanation for class theory was that socialism in Palestine could come about only in the wake of a class struggle by the proletariat and its taking over of political rule. Because of this, Borochov believed that the constructive economic activities undertaken by the proletariat would not lead to socialism. He saw cooperation merely as an enterprise which had little to do with the realization of socialism. Section 6. The First World War placed the Marxism of Poale Zion in the international arena. Until 1914, Poale Zion had not been accepted into the Socialist International, and it therefore did not have to take any stand on international problems. The Russian Revolution was not yet feasible, so that the debates on Marxist topics centered on the question of Zionism. During the war, Poale Zion concentrated its political efforts on the question of Jewish nationality, its rights and recognition, rather than on the, quote, world-class struggle. There were many views within Poale Zion with regard to the war itself. There were internationalists, neutralists, and those who favored active participation. The Russian Poale Zion members tended to align themselves with the Simmerwald group. However, it was generally agreed that the international workers' movement had failed to prepare its members to face war danger since it had avoided the question of nationalism. During the war, Poale Zion applied to various international socialist fora, and in 1916 were accepted into what was left of the Socialist International. In 1917, Poale Zion appeared before the Dutch Scandinavian Committee in preparation for the proposed Stockholm Convention. At these meetings, it formulated its stand and its demands in the nationalist sphere in universalist and largely Marxist terms. The question of the Jewish proletariat and the Jewish proletariat's special fate, which would be resolved only through the establishment of a national Jewish community in undeveloped Palestine, was presented as part of the more general problem of the right of economically dispossessed and oppressed peoples to emigrate to underdeveloped areas. For the first time, this claim gained wide acceptance and support among socialists in general. The Bolshevik Revolution and the British Mandate in Palestine evoked within the Zionist Marxist camp varied attitudes with regard both to the revolution itself and to Zionism. In the years 1919 and 1920, debates on the content and meaning of Marxism accompanied the greater debates which split Poale Zion into those who adopted communism and those who dissociated themselves from communism. On the socialist plane, there was a debate as to whether the communist takeover of political power is the only way to realize the aims of the socialist idea. It was agreed that this was a revolutionary era and that capitalism would never recover from the wounds inflicted by the war. However, the Marxists, such as Shlomo Kaplansky and some members of the Polish party of Poale Zion, continued to hold the accepted Marxist position that the revolution must base itself on the large proletariats of great industrial nations and has no chance of succeeding without them. They therefore supported the re-establishment of the Second International, although they wanted to give it a more revolutionary demeanor. They were prepared to abandon democracy, but only in favor of dictatorship of the whole proletariat, and not that of one party ruling through terror. Sections of the Russian, Austrian, and Polish parties adopted the Bolshevist position. They claimed that in the age of revolution, the avant-garde determined the policies of the entire proletariat, and that the parties of the Comintern were indeed the very pioneers who would bring about the socialist revolution. Along with the debate on communism in the socialist sphere in Poale Zion, there came an even sharper debate on the meaning of communism in the national and Zionist spheres. Borochov's key position combined class radicalism with the demand for national autonomy. Borochov estimated that the rise of the proletariat to power would bring about much self-determination for the various nations, whether on a territorial or personal basis. At the advent of the Bolshevik Revolution, Borochov himself led a campaign for national rights in Russia until his premature death at the end of 1917. This revolution established an ambivalent position towards nations. The Bolsheviks theoretically supported nations' right to self-determination, but saw nations as subject to higher revolutionary interests. The meaning of a separate Jewish existence and its nationalist format became a problem in and of itself, different from the problems of attitude towards nationalism and revolution in general. In the specifically Jewish and Zionist areas, there were more heated arguments on the meaning of Marxism within Poale Zion. The basic tenets of Borochov's theory were subject to a new test. The revolution appeared as a universal authority for which all particular interests were to be sacrificed. Moreover, the concept of, quote, national economy, end quote, and the interests of the working class within it were not considered unquestionable. Borochov's contention was that Zionism would be realized before the socialist revolution. When the socialist revolution actually came first, his theories were looked upon with doubt. Some members of Poale Zion claimed that revolutionary processes in fact supported Borochov's theories in that they uncovered the special damage done to the Jewish economy at the time of the revolution. Others suggest that the revolution could solve the particular problems of Jewish economy by organization of the ruling government, which would bring about economic changes or would itself initiate territorial concentration of the Jewish masses. Even the concept of the spontaneous process, spontaneous immigration of Jews to Palestine, was put to the test. According to some circles in Poale Zion, there is no place in the revolutionary age for processes not directed by the Supreme Revolutionary Command. Similarly, the idea of interclass cooperation received new meaning during the Age of Revolution. The cooperation of the Jewish proletariat with the bourgeoisie in a voluntary organization such as the Zionist Congress went against the principles of class struggle and was considered counter-revolutionary. The Zionist movement was condemned for cooperating with imperialist, quote, imperialist forces when it worked together with Great Britain. The meaning for Poale Zion of Marxist doctrine could therefore be taken in various and even conflicting ways, Zionist and anti-Zionist. During the revolutionary era, the struggle of the proletariat to seize political power and to realize socialism could be interpreted as emigration to Palestine in order to establish a Jewish proletariat and carry out the socialist revolution, or conversely, as the abandonment of Zionism. The Jewish proletariat gathering in Palestine appeared as a solution to the Jewish problem, either by creating a Jewish majority and a Jewish economy in Palestine, or by its constituting an expeditionary force for the revolution in the midst of an Arab proletariat. The attitude towards constructive institutions prior to political takeover also changed during the revolutionary age. Orthodox Marxists were prepared to recognize their importance as experiments even before proletarian control, although Borochov dissented. Similarly, opinions on a political party necessarily underwent a new test. Poale Zion did not establish prior to the revolution whether Poale Zion supported a broad-based workers' party or a smaller party rendered more cohesive by doctrine. Actually, it chose the German social democratic model of a party crystallized through ideological unity and political activity. It was in 1919 that the type of organization in Palestine changed and the local Poale Zion party merged with other groups, creating a wide-ranging organization called Adut HaAvoda, which was both a political party and a trade union. Adut HaAvoda, which translates to labor unity from Hebrew, was the name used by a series of political parties in Israel. Adut HaAvoda, in its first incarnation, was led by David Ben-Gurion. It was first established during the period of British Mandate and later became part of the Israeli political establishment. It was one of the forerunners of modern-day Israeli Labor Party, Israeli Labor Party. Back to the text. Section 7. The Central Workers' Party in Palestine, Adut HaAvoda, Unity of Labor, was not based on the Marxist model, but regarded Marx as one of its mentors, as is evidenced by Adut HaAvoda's very foundation on a class basis. Similarly, the Jewish laborers in Palestine took over the attitude to Marx as one of the prophets of the destiny of the workers in the fabric of history. However, Adut HaAvoda itself was established as a result of the criticism of many of the practical foundations of Marxism which permeated the Zionist workers' movement. Zionist Marxism began with objections to Marxism and Marxism's chief opponents, Karl Kautsky and G. Plekhanov, with regard to the question of nationalism in general and the Jewish question in particular, although Borochov anchored his Zionism in a process of class struggle and political takeover by the proletariat. Adut HaAvoda strayed from this path as well when it declared that the primary purpose of a workers' movement is not to seize political power but to construct a socialist workers' economy without a capitalist phase. Another heretical idea was interclass cooperation, since, according to Adut HaAvoda, the workers' economy was to be built by the immigration of pioneers from all sectors of the Jewish people, especially the young, and by the collection of funds from all social classes organized in the Zionist movement. Marxism was further challenged in its Borochovist formulation by a lack of faith in the, quote, spontaneous process of the natural immigration of capital and labor to result from the class struggle. Adut HaAvoda stood for the deliberate promotion of immigration. A fourth area in which the Adut HaAvoda deviated from the accepted Marxist line of Poale Zion was in the question of party structure. Adut HaAvoda was established in 1919 as a trade union and political party. Its founders did not want to separate the objective class status of the workers from that of those who were consciously united in the party itself. They stipulated that there was to be no distinction between concept and reality, party and class. Here they differed even with their non-communist colleagues outside Palestine in right Poale Zion. These Adut HaAvoda allies objected to any change in the German SD model, which separated the trade unions from the party and rendered the former subject to the latter. They saw in the structure of Adut HaAvoda a form of syndicalism which by 1919 had spread throughout Europe and had gained the support of the Bolsheviks. Adut Ha'avoda responded by a tendency to refer to the model organization of the period of the First International for workers, a form trade-based and approved by Marx himself. Adut Ha'avoda's ideological outlook was similarly divergent. Marxism was viewed as only one of the possible foundations for socialism, and Borokhovism as only one of the possible foundations for nationalism. The many interpretations applied to Marxism after World War I allowed the members of Adut Ha'avoda to escape any compulsory ideological model. Historical materialism. Sorry, I feel like I fucked something up. Adut Ha'avoda's ideological outlook was similarly divergent. Marxism was viewed as only one of the possible foundations for socialism, and Borokhovism as only one of the possible foundations for nationalism. The many interpretations applied to Marxism after World War I allowed the members of Adut Ha'avoda to escape any compulsory ideological model. Historical materialism, which was thought by many Zionists to be destructive to them, despite Borochov's version, ceased to be the accepted discipline. Burl Katznelson one of the leaders of Adut Ha'avoda, expressed his objection to dogmatic ideology as follows, quote, Marxism and Darwinism were undeniable in serving as compasses of human thought, ... However, when these laws are accepted as articles of faith, when these laws become fixed commandments which are not to be questioned, they do not lose their enlightening content. Do they not lose their enlightening content? Do they not lose their enlightening content and become a kind of modern-day fetishism and the source of a frightening fanaticism, obstruction, and oppression, end quote. I'm going to read the Wikipedia real quick for Burl Katznelson. Burl Katznelson lived from 1887 to 1944. Burl Katznelson was one of the intellectual founders of Labor Zionism and was instrumental to the establishment of the modern state of Israel. Burl Katznelson was also the editor of Dvar, the first daily newspaper of Histadrut. Burl Katznelson was born to a Lithuanian Jewish family in Babruysk, Russian Empire, nowadays Belarus, son of a member of Poale Zion. Burl Katznelson dreamed of settling in the Jewish homeland from an early age. In Russia, Burl Katznelson was a librarian in a Hebrew-Yiddish library. In Russia, Burl Katznelson was a librarian in a Hebrew-Yiddish library and taught Hebrew literature and Jewish history. Burl Katznelson made Aliyah to Ottoman Palestine in 1909, where Burl Katznelson worked in agriculture and took an active role in organizing workers' federations based on the idea of, quote, common work, life, and aspirations, end quote. Together with Burl Katznelson's cousin, Yitzhak Tebenkin, Burl Katznelson was one of the founding fathers of the Workers' Union, the Histadrut, founded in 1920 in Mandatory Palestine and then part of the Yeshuv, the body of Jewish residents in the region before Israel's creation. In this capacity, together with Mayor Rotberg of the Kinneret Farm, Katznelson founded in 1916 the consumer cooperative known as Hamash Beer, with the goal of supplying the Jewish communities of Palestine with food at affordable prices during the terrible shortage years of the First World War. When the British Army reached southern Palestine in 1918, Katznelson joined the Jewish Legion. Katznelson was released from the army in 1920 and resumed Burl Katznelson's activities in the Labor Zionist movement. Burl Katznelson helped to establish the Kolatt Health Services Sick Fund, a major fixture in Israel's network of socialized medicine. In 1925, together with Moshe Beilinson, Katznelson established the Devar daily paper and became Devar's first editor, a position Burl Katznelson held until Burl Katznelson's death, as well as becoming the founder and first editor-in-chief of Oved Publishing House. Burl Katznelson was well known for his desire for peaceful coexistence between Arabs and Jews in Mandatory Palestine. Burl Katznelson was an outspoken opponent of the Peel Commission's partition plan for Palestine. He stated, quote, "I do not wish to see the realization of Zionism in the form of the new Polish state with Arabs in the position of the Jews and the Jews in the positions of the Poles, the ruling people. For me, this would be the complete perversion of the Zionist ideal, ... Our generation has been witness to the fact that nations aspiring to freedom who threw off the yoke of subjugation rushed to place this yoke on the shoulders of others. Over the generations in which we were persecuted and exiled and slaughtered, we learned not only the pain of exile and subjugation, but also contempt for tyranny. Was that only a case of sour grapes? Are we now nurturing the dream of slaves who wish to reign?" End quote. Burl Katznelson. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Burl Katznelson advocated that the transfer of the natives of Palestine be extended, citing as a positive model the Soviet deportation of the Volga Germans to Siberia. In a 1937 Congress of the Mapai, Burl Katznelson stated, quote, "The question of the transfer of population has given rise to discussion among us. Is it allowed or forbidden? My conscience is clear on this point. Absolutely. A remote neighbor is better than a close enemy. They will not lose from being transferred, and we shall certainly not lose from it. ... I have long been of the opinion that this is the best of all solutions, and in the days of gloom I was reinforced in my awareness that it must come someday. But I never imagined that the transfer would be merely to the neighborhood of Nablus. I always believed that they were destined to be transferred to Syria and Iraq." Burl Katznelson also spoke of Jewish self-hatred, saying, quote, "Is there another people on earth so emotionally twisted that they consider everything their nation does despicable and hateful, while every murder, rape, robbery committed by their enemies fills their hearts with admiration and awe?" End quote. Burl Katznelson. Burl Katznelson died of an aneurysm in 1944 and was buried at his request in the cemetery on the shores of the Sea of Galilee next to Sarah Schmuckler. In her biography, Golda Meir remembers Burl Katznelson as a pivotal figure in the life of the Jewish community in Palestine. Quote, "Burl was not at all physically impressive. Burl was small. Burl's hair was always untidy. Burl's clothes always looked rumpled. But Burl's lovely smile lit up his face, and Burl looked right through you, so that no one who ever talked to Burl forgot Burl. I think of Burl as I saw Burl, hundreds of times, buried in a shabby old armchair in one of the two book-lined rooms in which Burl lived in the heart of old Tel Aviv, where everyone came to see Burl and where Burl worked, because Burl hated going to an office. Quote, Burl would like you to stop by, end quote, was like a command that no one disobeyed. Not that Burl held court or ever gave orders, but nothing was done, no decision of any importance to the labor movement in particular, or the Yishuv in general, was taken without Berl's opinion being sought first. Katznelson is commemorated in many places in name. Beit Berl near Tzofit, Ohalo, literally his tent on the Sea of Galilee, and Kibbutz Be'eri, which takes Katznelson's literary name. Many streets throughout Israel are named in Katznelson's memory, including a high school in Kfar Saba, and the Israeli Postal Service has issued a commemorative stamp. Back to the text. This viewpoint remained that of the mainstream of workers in Palestine. Of course, the concept of, quote, class struggle did indicate a sort of inclination toward Marxism, but it was reinterpreted as to lose its universalist interpretation and take on a unique Palestinian meaning, one constructive rather than militant. While the leaders and ideologists of Adrat HaAvoda were presenting their organization as a Zionist Socialist Workers Organization which was free from dogmatic definitions, Marxists were calling Adrat HaAvoda anti-Marxist. Adrat HaAvoda's abandonment of the idea of a party with a clearly delineated doctrinal line in favor of a broader-based union struck at the Social Democratic Party model and stood in evident opposition to any revolutionary party model. The gap between Marxist ideology and the idea of overall incorporation of the workers into one party had been growing steadily since 1919. The supporters of such association viewed Marxism at its best as one of the possible systems within the Zionist socialist world. Unity was more important than dogmatic coherence. Marxists, on the other hand, preferred ideological clarity to the scope of such unity. Some of them gave explicit preference to a, quote, vanguard party over a, quote, class party. The ideological controversy within the workers' movement in Palestine did not therefore center on the various creeds of Marxism, orthodox or reformist, but on the idea of workers' unity and the absence of theoretical dogmatism as against orthodox Marxism. The politics of Adrat HaAvoda made it even more suspect than did its structure. According to the Marxist viewpoint, the idea of building a socialist economy in Palestine could, for economic reasons, succeed only in part. However, the arguments against such an economy, according to socialist criteria, were even stronger. Isolated cells of producers within agriculture and industry were suspected by Marxists of being disloyal to socialist principles and of offering an inadequate foundation for future socialist revolution. In 1920, the Histadrut was founded, and it took over the professional and cooperative functions. In contrast to Adrat HaAvoda, the, quote, leftist Poale Zion maintained its Zionist Marxist orthodoxy and gave it new meaning within the Palestinian reality. In 1920, the Poale Zion was divided over the question of immediate alignment with the Comintern and of interclass cooperation at the Zionist Congress. Quote, leftist Poale Zion wanted to leave the Congress and join the Comintern, whose refusal to recognize Zionism led several to abandon the group and join communism outright. Another faction remained loyal to Zionism, although maintaining a theoretical inclination to communism within the general socialist field, despite being completely opposed to communism in the politics of Palestine. Their meaning of Marxism within the Palestinian reality was not the advancement of the Arab proletariat, which scarcely existed, under the leadership of the Jewish minority, in preparation for the revolution, as was desired by anti-Zionist communists. Quote, leftist Poale Zion continued to support the Borochovist notion of the need and right of the Jewish proletariat to emigrate to Palestine. However, in contrast to Adat HaAvoda, the leftist Poale Zion claimed that Palestine would be built as a capitalist state and could not initially be constructed as a socialist state, and established its position vis-a-vis the structure and purpose of the labor movement in Palestine accordingly. It demanded energetic political activity among the workers' parties and objected to any obscuring of the special nature of such a policy within the general policies of Zionism. The workers should stand out in their objection to British imperialism. It called for active trade operations and decried, quote, moderation with regard to the constructive tasks of the workers and their responsibility for the economy. It demanded a separation of the trade and constructive tasks of the Histadrut in order that the latter should not interfere with the former. The principal front of the class struggle was, it felt, the professional front. It also believed in class solidarity among Jewish and Arab workers and wished for improvement of these mutual ties, although not at the expense of Jewish emigration to Palestine. It was not only communism on the one hand and Adat HaAvoda on the other which established the position of the Marxist Zionists of leftist Poale Zion. The realities of Palestine presented a problem for Orthodox Marxists which eventually led to rifts in 1928 and 1934 and to the establishment of two separate parties. The Orthodox leftist Poale Zion continued to rally around the case of the spontaneous process as a reason for immigration. It did not support a wider voluntary immigration. The failure of its members to participate in the Zionist movement made it difficult for them to receive immigration visas, since the Zionist organization was responsible for their distribution. Palestine was considered by them to be the future land of concentration of the Jewish proletariat, although at present most of their members were in the diaspora. On the other hand, there was in Palestine a group of Marxist members of the leftist Poale Zion who sought to make the Borochovist doctrine into a basis for a territorial Marxist workers' party. They emphasized on the global Jewish proletariat. They emphasized not the global Jewish proletariat of Borochov's theory, but the territorial aspects. They believed in combining Zionist activism with Jewish-Arab solidarity. They encouraged Jewish immigration and fought, quote, British imperialism. During the 30s, the Palestinian capitalist economy grew, and British Zionist cooperation began to show signs of strain. The Palestinian Marxist Party claimed that it would unite the Jewish and Arab proletariats in their struggle against British imperialism. These, quote, Marxist circles were Zionist and calculated that the Arab proletariat would agree to Jewish immigration and even be interested in Jewish immigration, since Jewish immigration would develop the local economy and prepare the way for the struggle of the proletariat and the socialist revolution. The fate of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe changed the attitudes of the two factions. In 1939, they abandoned their objections to interclass cooperation and rejoined the Zionist movement, from which they had seceded in 1920, and the Russians in 1909. New section, Section 9. At the time when Marxism was not considered compulsory for Adat HaAvoda, and when leftist Poale Zion aspired to adapt Marxist orthodoxy to world, Jewish, and Zionist realities, a new trend of Zionist Marxism appeared on the scene. The, quote, baptism of Hashomer Hatzair into Marxism in the 1920s is one of the most exciting intellectual chapters in the modern history of Zionism in Palestine. Hashomer Hatzair is a Labor Zionist secular Jewish youth movement founded in 1913 in the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, Austria-Hungary. Hashomer Hatzair was also the name of the Hashomer Hatzair Workers' Party, the group's political party in the Yishuv in Mandatory Palestine. Hashomer Hatzair, along with Ha Noir Ha Oved Ve Ha Lomed of Israel, is a member of the International Falcon Movement, Socialist Educational International. Back to the text. The baptism of Hashomer Hatzair into Marxism bears testimony to the historical essentiality of Marxism in those years, which saw a new wave of Marxism that was to grow and intensify until it reached its political peak in the 1950s, whereupon it would disintegrate in face of the political reality. Hashomer Hatzair developed from a youth movement which was devoted to the ideas of Nietzsche, Weineken, and Bleuer, and Freud on the perfection of the ideal individual and the good community. I don't know I can't find out who this Weineken is, and let's see if this Bleuer person says anything. It looks like this is in reference to Hans Bleuer. Hans Bleuer was a German writer and philosopher. Hans Bleuer attained prominence as an early member and quote, first historian of the Wandervogel movement. Hans Bleuer was aided by his taboo-breaking rebellion against schools and the church. Hans Bleuer was received with some genuine interest, but sometimes perceived as scandalous. During the transition from the German Empire to the Weimar liberal democracy, Bleuer, a radical conservative and monarchist, became a staunch opponent of the Weimar Republic. In 1928, Hans Bleuer had the opportunity to meet former Kaiser Wilhelm II in exile in the Netherlands. Bleuer believed that pederasty and male bonding provided a basis for a stronger nation and state, which became a popular concept within certain segments of the Hitler Youth. Bleuer later supported the Nazis, but turned on them in 1934 when SA leader Ernst Röhm was murdered on Hitler's orders during the Night of the Long Knives. Since 1924, Bleuer, who had married a doctor and had 2 children, had worked as a freelance writer and practicing psychologist in Berlin-Hermsdorf. Hans Bleuer worked there after his retirement from public life during the Nazi period. On his major philosophical work of 1949, Die Achse der Natur. So I'm assuming that's the Bleuer that's being referred to here, but I'm not sure. At one particular stage, Hashomer Hatzair's subjectivism reached its limits, and Hashomer Hatzair began to seek the connection with Palestinian and global realities, whose respective influence on Hashomer Hatzair in the first half of the 1920s is difficult to determine. In the former, there was the central problem of the failure to build up Palestine as a socialist society according to the constructive method of Adut HaAvoda. Leftists in the, quote, Labor Brigade concluded from this that socialism would be realized through a class struggle in which the task of the kibbutzim was partial but decisive. They began to claim that Zionism by itself does not advance socialism, and that therefore one should not place the burden of building Zionism upon the workers. Hashomer Hatzair itself agreed that the identity between Zionism and socialism, which Adut HaAvoda was trying to create, did not really exist anymore, although its conclusions from this were different from those of the above-mentioned labor brigade. Borochovism was essential to Hashomer Hatzair, just as it was to the older generation, although the former had certain additional reasons. Borochovism interpreted Zionism in an objective manner, which was not anchored in the individual's will or spiritual assets, but in the all-powerful process taking place in reality. The productive and territorial elements became the mainspring of nationhood. These bases were considered to be firmer than the historical link. In addition, Zionism became associated with the worldwide class struggle, although at the first stage it was realized capitalistically and within the framework of the British Empire. Hashomer Hatzair differed in several basic respects from the Marxist creed of leftist Poale Zion. Hashomer Hatzair viewed Aliyah, immigration, as a volitional act, not a spontaneous process, and brought the idea of the realization of Zionism by the Jewish proletariat in the diaspora, as expressed by the early Poale Zion at the beginning of the century, to the Jewish youth of the middle class who are becoming impoverished. Hashomer Hatzair even used Leninist terms and claimed that the Jewish workers' movement in the diaspora, Zionist and non-Zionist alike, were tainted by, quote, economism, concerned only about the present and not interested in the future revolutionary situation of Palestine, whereas Jewish youth would fulfill Zionism by emigrating to Palestine. Borochov's claim against the Bund was now directed to the class at large. Hashomer Hatzair stressed the importance of building a workers' economy, quote, constructivism, more than did older Marxists. Hashomer Hatzair saw itself as the vanguard for the establishment of such an economy, although it did not believe that this would by itself lead to socialism, as did Adut HaAvoda. In contradistinction to the Marxists of the leftist Poale Zion, Hashomer Hatzair did not participate in the Zionist movement and recognized the need for cooperation with different classes within the Jewish people. It criticized the Borochovist theory, which stated that the proletariat does not possess the status of national leadership before seizing political power. Even the rightist members of Poale Zion were condemned for their inadequate activity in the executive branches of the Zionist Federation. However, Hashomer Hatzair refused to accept constructivism as the main content of class war in the Palestinian reality, or to contend that socialism could be realized without revolution. It therefore had to dissociate itself from traditional Borochovism on the one hand and the concept of Zionist unity with socialism of Adut HaAvoda on the other. Hashomer Hatzair solved the contradiction between orthodox Borochovism and its own position by creating the, quote, etapist theory, according to which Jewish socialist society would be realized in two stages. In the first stage, the Jewish national home would be established in Eretz Israel, based on a productive and self-sufficient economic foundation. In the second stage, the social revolution itself would be accomplished. The function of the Zionist movement and Zionist cooperation was limited to the first stage only. It would be terminated after the economic, cultural, and political foundations had been laid in Palestine, after the national funds based on national donations were no longer required. Partnership with the Zionists was therefore considered as only temporary. The social revolution was to be realized, however, by the international organization of the workers, i.e., Jewish-Arab collaboration. This, quote, theory of stages, formulated by Meir Yari had many advantages for Hashomer Hatzair. I'm going to quickly read the Wikipedia for Meir Ya'ari. Meir Ya'ari lived from 1897 to 1987 and was an Israeli politician, educator, and social activist. He was the leader of Hashomer Hatzair, Kibbutz Artzi, and Mapam, and a member of the Knesset. Meir Wald, later Ya'ari, was born in Kantsuga in the Galicia area of Austria-Hungary in 1897. Meir Ya'ari's family came from a long lineage of rabbinic scholars. At half a year old, Meir Ya'ari and his family moved to Rzhezhov, where he grew up. He would eventually become active in Poale Zion youth movement. At the outbreak of World War I, Meir Ya'ari's family moved to Vienna. At the age of 17, Meir Ya'ari volunteered for the Austrian army and served as an officer until the end of the war. Meir Ya'ari studied at the Agricultural Academy and at the University of Vienna. In 1919, Meir Ya'ari co-founded and co-led the Viennese branch of Hashomer Hatzair. In 1920, Meir Ya'ari made Aliyah to Palestine. Meir Ya'ari worked at the Kinneret Moshava and in the Gedud HaAvoda group, paving roads from Tiberias to Zimah and Tabga. Meir Ya'ari's grandson, Yedidia Ya'ari, is a retired Israeli Defense Forces general. Meir Ya'ari was one of the founders of Bitania, the first collective settlement of Hashomer Hatzair. Meir Ya'ari was among the founders of the Histadrut Workers Syndicate. From 1924 onwards, Meir Ya'ari served as secretary of the World Hashomer Hatzair. In 1927, Meir Ya'ari founded Kibbutz Artzi, was elected Kibbutz Artzi's secretary, and took part in drafting Kibbutz Artzi's principles. In 1929, Meir Ya'ari was among the founders of Kibbutz Merhavia, where Meir Ya'ari lived until he died. In 1948, Meir Ya'ari co-founded Mapam political party as its leader and functioned as its general secretary until 1973. Meir Ya'ari was a Mapam MK in the 1st through 7th Knessets from 1949 to 1973. In the first Knesset, Meir Ya'ari was member of the Knesset Committee, and in the 5th through 7th Knessets, Meir Ya'ari was a member of Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Meir Ya'ari's movement co-leader and almost equal colleague was Yaakov Hazan. For many years, they led Hashomer Hatzair and Mapam together. Despite holding the top two positions in Mapam's list, they made a joint decision not to become ministers, but rather occupy themselves in the movement's ideological and educational activities. As leader and ideologist of Hashomer Hatzair, Meir Ya'ari sought to turn it from a scout-like youth movement promoting abstract socialist humanist ideas to a political settlement movement that integrates Zionism and Marxism. Meir Ya'ari protested David Ben-Gurion's activism and Mapai's moderate socialism. Meir Ya'ari regarded highly the achievements of revolutionary socialism in the Soviet Union, although Meir Ya'ari criticized its attitude toward Zionism. In the 1940s, Meir Yaari opposed the Biltmore program and supported the one-state solution. During Israel's early years, Meir Yaari objected to his party's coalition membership and was an outspoken critic of the government's Western orientation, the nationality conception, the reparations agreement, and the martial law. At first, Meir Yaari supported the Soviet Union and tried, along with Moshe Sneh, to introduce Hashomer Hatzair's ideas in Mapam. The exposure of Stalin's wrongdoings caused a schism in the Marxist orientation, resulting in the expulsion of Moshe Sneh's men from the party in 1953. Gradually, admiration for the Soviet Union lessened and inclination to cooperate with Mapai increased, and in 1955, Mapam indeed joined Mapai in the coalition. After the Six-Day War, Meir Yaari expressed a relatively hawkish stand by opposing immediate withdrawal from the occupied territories. In 1969, Meir Yaari supported Mapam's alliance with Mapai as part of the alignment. In 1984, he would support staying in the alignment until the formation of the National Unity Government in 1984. To his honor, the Association for Progressive Education in honor of Meir Yaari was founded. Over the past decades, Yaari envisioned, designed, and implemented many peace-building projects in the region, and especially in Cyprus. Oh, that's the organization's name. Sorry. To his honor, the Association for Progressive Education in honor of Meir Yaari, which is titled Yaari, Yaari, was founded. Over the past decades, Yaari, the organization, envisioned, designed, and implemented many peace-building projects in the region, especially in Cyprus. Yaari has also implemented a large-scale EC-supported project known as Act Beyond Borders, which promoted reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians through education. So, thank you for listening to that. Back to the text. Where am I? This, quote, theory of stages formulated by Meir Yaari had many advantages for Hashomer Hatzair. It could continue to participate in the Zionist organization, to build socialist cells within the framework of the existing regime, and, at the same time, to maintain revolutionary radicalism. It could sustain its criticism of... Oh, God, how do you say it? Fuck. God damn it. God, this is annoying. Alright, what was it? I'm sorry. I'm trying to follow the names of these organizations, and I keep losing them. Adat HaAvoda. Where am I? Hashomer Hatzair could sustain Hashomer Hatzair's criticism of Adat HaAvoda in the 1920s and of Mapai in the 30s by contending that the idea of realizing Zionism in collaboration with the Zionist movement and the building of a workers' economy were an illusion and constituted, quote, social reformism, which blunts the edge of class struggle and obscures the goals of socialism. However, every attempt by Hashomer Hatzair to explain the class struggle in such a manner as would lead to the realization of socialism in Palestine without putting Zionism out of mind entirely was doomed to failure. The Palestinian reality made it necessary to maintain the development of all kinds of Jewish capital and to limit the class struggle so that it would not destroy the foundations of the Jewish economy. Enmity between Arabs and Jews prevented their cooperating in the class struggle. Members of Mapai, on the other hand, asserted that such division into stages invites a division of allegiances. They maintained that Zionism and socialism were intertwined, if not identical processes. According to Mapai, Hashomer Hatzair's contention that its collaboration with the Zionists was only temporary, and that there existed, quote, tragic contradictions, end quote, between the process of national liberation and participation in the socialist revolution, pushed it towards anti-Zionist communism. The doctrinaire controversy was closely linked to organizational disagreements. Paradoxically, the Marxist revolutionaries of Hashomer Hatzair did not endeavor to find organizational expression in broader union organizations. They retained the collective organizational model which was being created even before the adoption of Marxist doctrine. The Mid-20s Party was, in their eyes, a ruling body which sought to govern the working class itself. They maintained that Adut HaAvoda and Mapai's contentions that they were fulfilling socialism were but a means for setting up a ruling mechanism. The majority within the workers' movement in the country was defined by Hashomer Hatzair as adhering to, quote, social democracy, which to it represented a combination of two negative manifestations: a political machine divorced from the community, kibbutz, and from creativity, on the one hand, and abandonment of the socialist revolution on the other. However, Hashomer Hatzair felt the tension of the endeavor to maintain community of primary relations, which builds the economy, a kibbutz, and at the same time to act within the political reality. The incompatibility of Marxism to Palestinian realities, and the internal and external conflicts as to content, which were pointed out by Hashomer Hatzair, lead us to ask why Marxism was adopted at the end of the 1920s, not in the real Palestinian framework, but in the ideological, sociological, and psychological spheres of Hashomer Hatzair. We may see in this a solution to the tensions between the attractive forces of communism on Jewish youth from Eastern Europe and the settlement organizations in Palestine. Meir Yaari himself explained the adoption of Marxism in psychological terms as the expression of youth from the small bourgeois class who had been forced to descend in social status and therefore seized hold of the theory which would give direction to the working class, the new class into which they were absorbed, while Eliezer Hacohen, one of the ideological leaders of Hashomer Hatzair, described the reason for it as follows, quote, "For us, Marxism was the key to renewing our spiritual creativity, the melting pot of desires, aspirations, beliefs, and opinions in all aspects of life, molding them into a comprehensive universal outlook which not only served for direct self-gratification, but would also become an active part of the objective existence and enterprise and give us access to the universe," end quote. Eliezer Hacohen. I'm not seeing for anything for this Eliezer Hacohen. Back to the text. The adoption of Marxism may be interpreted as a result of the imminent development of the concepts of a youth movement and the community which establishes it. It may be interpreted against the background of the reality of Jewish youth in the diaspora and their confrontation with the communist and socialist trends which set up norms for national loyalty and revolutionary activity. However, the test of Marxism for Hashomer Hatzair was the political reality of Palestine. The, quote, two-stage theory in itself did not define Hashomer Hatzair's position on the appropriate form of organizational body for the labor movement or for Zionist and Palestinian politics. One second. In 1930, Adat HaAvoda and Poale Hatzair merged and formed Mapai. Poale Hatzair was a Zionist group active in Palestine from 1905 until 1930. Poale Hatzair was founded by A.D. Gordon, Yosef Aharonovich, Yosef Sprinzak, and followed a non-Marxist Zionist Socialist agenda. Poale Hatzair was a pacifist, anti-militarist group that sought to establish a Jewish foothold in Palestine through manual labor and agricultural settlement. Back to the text. In 1930, Adat HaAvoda and Poale Hatzair merged and formed Mapai, which was set up as a, quote, class party. And, of course, Mapai was a labor Zionist and democratic socialist political party in Israel and was the dominant force in Israeli politics until Mapai's merger into the modern-day Israeli Labor Party in January 1968. During Mapai's time in office, a wide range of progressive reforms were carried out, as characterized by the establishment of a welfare state, providing minimum income, security, and free or almost free access to housing subsidies and health and social services. Back to the text. So let me repeat that whole sentence again. In 1930, Adat HaAvoda and Poale Hatzair merged and formed Mapai, which was set up as a, quote, class party, i.e. a party which would unite all members of the working class, or at least the active elements thereof. A political union of workers would suit well with Marxism. At the same time, Hashomer Hatzair retracted its former opposition to a political body separate from the community of producers at large. Hashomer Hatzair recognized that one should not equate the cooperative cells, kibbutzim, with the entire scope of political activities, and that there is indeed a place for a political party separate from the economic organization. Even more, within Hashomer Hatzair itself, there emerged a group from the Austrian Hashomer Hatzair in particular, which saw itself as Marxist and, along with this, supported participation in a broad-based political party. As against this, the Hashomer Hatzair leadership, headed by Meir Yaari, interpreted Marxism not as a motivation for establishing a wide political party, but as one for crystallizing a party based on a clear program and avant-garde groups. This position rested upon the special conditions of Palestine and basic general principles which stated that when one tries to equate a class with a party, there is always a danger that the class will take precedence over ideas and ideals. In addition, the continuing differentiation between the social democratic reformist world and that of revolutionary socialism prevented any kind of union. With respect to Palestinian realities, one could claim that there was a lack of primary motivation to establish a political party of broadest scope. That is, a parliamentary body set up by a general election, and therefore that it was not feasible to do so. At the beginning of the 1930s, there was even a suspicion on the part of Hashomer Hatzair that joining a broad-based political party would move the center of gravity away from the settlement organizations, the kibbutzim, which were considered the mainstay of political activity. As a result of these contentions, the position of the Austrian Hashomer Hatzair was rejected, since the Austrians inherited from the National Marxist Party a positive attitude to a united class party and compared it with Mapai in Palestine. Hashomer Hatzair's leadership not only objected to a comprehensive political union which lacked clear Marxist lines, but even stipulated for Marxist principles within the Palestinian reality. These principles were a more energetic, quote, class struggle within the Jewish Yishuv and the Zionist Federation, organization of the Arab workers, and dissent from the Second International, which Mapai had joined. The class struggle in the sphere of labor relations and other aspects of societal life would bring the socialist revolution in Palestine closer. Mapai's leadership, however, saw the role of the workers within the Jewish community as leading the combined efforts of all its members to widen the economic and demographic basis of the Jewish national homeland. Within this framework, it of course encouraged both immigration of pioneers and workers and the labor economy, although it did not see this as tending to the socialist revolution, but to the realization of Zionism above all. International socialist questions, which are only of marginal interest to Mapai, were of key significance to Hashomer Hatzair. It was careful to phrase its positions in Palestine in such a manner as would be relevant to the international socialist revolution. We have already seen how this expressed itself in its Palestinian policies. Within the framework of global realities, Hashomer Hatzair did not support the Second International, which was, it felt, a clear expression of social democracy and reformism, and it was also critical of the Comintern and the Comintern's policies, especially with regard to the Middle East. Marxism for Hashomer Hatzair was not only a justification for revolutionary socialism and the foundation of Hashomer Hatzair's objection to social democracy, Marxist formulations could also serve as a guide for solving the problem of nationalism in Palestine. The communist interpretation of Marxism in the Palestinian reality gave priority to the existing proletariat, that is, the Arab proletariat, and saw the Arab proletariat as the forerunner of the revolution. Zionism was rendered invalid, as we have seen, both in and out of itself, and as a means for spreading the revolution in the Middle East. On the other hand, Hashomer Hatzair adopted Borochov's justification of Jewish proletariat nationalism. The Jewish need for, quote, conditions of production, end quote, and the need of the proletariat for a, quote, field of work, end quote, validated the Jewish settlement in Palestine, which had not done harm to the Arab proletariat, since the economic opportunities that it created could serve only to help it. In one respect, Hashomer Hatzair of the late 20s and early 30s accepted the kind of Marxism which plays down the importance of the state per se, and obviously that of the national state as well. The state, which is a result of class relations, is destined to disappear, or at least to become weakened in the socialist revolution. In contrast, a state built on class domination would arise as the force which would shape life in Palestine, the solidarity of the Jewish and Arab proletariats. These two basic positions had specific interpretations. Hashomer Hatzair established its stance with regard to labor relations in Palestine, which was said to further Jewish-Arab solidarity and suggest a political program for the future of Palestine. In the field of labor relations, Hashomer Hatzair objected to Mapai's demand for full Jewish labor in the agricultural settlements and demanded partial Arab labor as well. Hashomer Hatzair also supported professional organization of Arab laborers. The element of international class solidarity was stronger in its view than the element of zeal for an exclusive national economy. It believed that Jewish Arab proletarian solidarity would make it possible to direct a developing Jewish economy in Palestine. According to Hashomer Hatzair, the expansion of Jewish labor itself in the plantation was not to be considered as a national enterprise which demanded national interclass cooperation, nor as preceding cooperation with the Arab proletariat or the class struggle within Jewish society. Section 11. The question of Hashomer Hatzair's Marxism became of greater significance with reference to Hashomer Hatzair's dealings with Mapai on the subject of union in 1939-40. The ideology of the majority party as well as its political requirements propelled it towards union with Hashomer Hatzair, for it believed that ideological unity with respect to Zionism and socialism was sufficient for forming a political union as well. Global and Palestinian political realities only increased Hashomer Hatzair's political involvement, and in 1936 it aligned itself with urban workers who had organized the, quote, Socialist League. It was clear that if Hashomer Hatzair and Mapai did not combine, there would emerge a new left-leaning workers' party. The debate on merging with Mapai made evident the importance and meaning of Marxism for Hashomer Hatzair, as well as its disagreements with Mapai on the subject. Hashomer Hatzair demanded insertion of the terms, quote, Marxism and, quote, class struggle in the joint political platform, not only as a political subject, but also as a way of interpreting history. Mapai's leaders wished to preserve spiritual freedom and pluralism with regard to socialist viewpoints. Mapai suspected any dogma which would endanger their Zionist loyalties or dictate their political behavior. Union among workers appeared to them to be implanted in the real political world and not in that of ideology. Complete and total union on both the ideological and political planes, and the possibility of transferring concepts from plane to plane, appeared to the vast majority of them to be at best doubtful. By contrast, there arose among Hashomer Hatzair a group of intellectuals who strove for unity based on doctrine and faith, action within the political sphere being possible only with overall loyalty to doctrine. Baruch Katznelson, the spiritual mentor of Mapai, viewed Hashomer Hatzair's demand for a Marxist spiritual definition as the dogmatization of general and Jewish historical conceptions. Attempts to express Jewish history in Marxist terms were always suspect in that they led to abandonment of content which was not expressible in such terms. Some of the Marxist formulations whose inclusion Hashomer Hatzair demanded within the platform are those of the, quote, working class and, quote, class struggle, two concepts without which there was no reason for the merger, according to Hashomer Hatzair. To this, Mapai responded with the answer given by the Social Democrats to the avant-gardists, that it was itself the representative of the working class and the class struggle in their respective interpretations within the Palestinian scene. Mapai returned to its unwavering stand that it is not the philosophical formulations of class struggle which are significant, but the unity of the workers and the practical political conclusions drawn from it. Hashomer Hatzair interpreted Marxism as sanctioning the dictatorship of the proletariat. Commenting on this, Baruch Katznelson claimed that this concept was destructive to the workers' movement, but within Mapai, Ben-Gurion was more tolerant of the idea, and it is obvious that the united Kibbutz Moahad, and Faction B, Siya Bet, inside Mapai did not reject it outright. Let's see if there's encyclopedia entries for any of these things. Ein Harad, or Ein Herod, is a kibbutz in northern Israel located in the Jezreel Valley near Mount Gilboa. It falls under the jurisdiction of Gilboa Regional Council. In 2022, it had a population of 779. The kibbutz was the home of the Yitzhak to Benkin, one of the founders of the United Kibbutz movement, and was a symbol of the kibbutz collectivist ideology. However, in 2009, it began a process of privatization. The United Kibbutz movement, also known by its Hebrew name Takam, I don't know if I'm saying that right, was founded in 1981 and was largely aligned with the Labor Party and the Labor Party's predecessors. The United Kibbutz movement, I don't think this is actually what we're referring to, but sorry, I'll continue. It had been formed by the merger itself when Ha-Kibbutz Ha-Moihad and Ihud Ha-Kibbutzat Ve Ha-Kibbutzim came together. Consequently, their respective youth movements merged into the Habanim Dror youth movement. In 1999, a third movement, Artsy, joined the United Kibbutz movement, although it maintains a certain autonomy, as does its Hashomer Hatzair youth movement. Ha-Kibbutz Ha-Moihad had been founded in 1927 by the union of several kibbutz bodies and was associated with Poale Zion and later Adut HaAvoda parties and was aligned with the Habanim youth movement. And let's see if there's anything for this Siya Bet group. I don't see anything. Anyway, back to the text. Section 12. The 1930s saw the political plan becoming more fateful and decisive than that of labor relations. At the beginning of the decade, Hashomer Hatzair thought it could solve the problem of relations among the different nationalities by extracting the political bone of contention in toto. The socialist regime would cancel out the national state and the class subservience which the national state entails. The accepted formula at the time was a, quote, binational socialist society, end quote. The test of Zionist loyalty did not come about in the 30s or in any other era, as a test of loyalty to this or that constitutional formula, but as one to the principle of maximum Jewish immigration and objection to any limitation to it. To this, Hashomer Hatzair stayed loyal throughout all its generations and even based it on Marxist principles. Zionism remained valid only insofar as Zionism fulfilled the needs of the masses of Jewish working people, as was stated at the start of the century. Thus, the program for political agreement with the Arabs was presented not only as a basic socialistic solution, but also as a means for realizing, quote, greater Zionism. At the beginning of the 1940s, Hashomer Hatzair presented its political program as a striving for a binational state in Palestine, that is, a state which would differentiate between governmental relations and the relative proportions of its population. Equality of nations would manifest itself in government, administration, economy, culture, language, and religion. This idea is not the only answer which Marxism offers for the question of nationality. In its consideration of the concept of a binational state, Hashomer Hatzair adopted one possible version of the Marxist tradition. It resembled the Austrian socialist school of thought, which demanded separation of national government from national autonomy. Hashomer Hatzair found it especially suitable for the situation in Palestine. Its nationalist foundation remained Borochovist and rested on the, quote, forces of production, end quote, which the territory supplies in the 40s. However, Hashomer Hatzair published Otto Bauer's book on the national question. That's apparently available on libcom. One second. I'm seeing if there's anything about Otto Bauer and nationalism. Anyway, not seeing anything. Back to the text. New section, section 13. In the late 30s and 40s, Hashomer Hatzair's Marxism was expanded from the field of political and social realities to the spiritual field. In place of the romanticism of the individual and society, Hashomer Hatzair demanded intellectual discipline and an intellectual framework which would not only be coherent and answer individual demands, but would also express reality, a theoretical framework which would allow action as well as thought. Eliezer HaKohen was the leader of this trend. The social science inherent in Marxism came, according to Eliezer HaKohen, to supplant religion and metaphysics, whose appeal extended beyond reality and man. Kantianism was rejected, since Kantianism was founded on a universe created by the subject, thus becoming a screen between the subject and reality, and this was presented as being in the interest of the bourgeoisie, which sought to restrict the spirit of social change. Marxism, on the other hand, appeared as a scientific system and a creator of reality. Only through Marxism was the philosophical goal of a comprehensive science of being realized. Marxist dialectics was considered a logic which grasped existence and was not merely a formalistic logic. Marxist dialectics was to serve in the struggle against the tendency towards specialization in the sciences. The early works of Marx, it was said, dealt with the psychology of the, quote, concrete man. This man became the model in Hashomer Hatzair education. The 1940s were also a period of publication of many relatively authorized translations of Marxist literature into Hebrew. Marx was retranslated, and the works of Kautsky, Luxemburg, Bauer, Bogdanov, Plekhanov were published. In the 50s, the works of Lenin and Stalin were also rendered into Hebrew. There was even a sharp disagreement between the far left and Burl Katznelson of Mapai with regard to translation politics. The latter desired to publish selected Marxist writings, explaining them in the context of the times and avoiding dogmatism. Section 15. Marxism aimed at integrating Hashomer, Hatzair, and Zionism in the international revolutionary process, though it was not an effective guide to active appreciation of international socialism in the 30s and 40s. Hashomer Hatzair avoided the Socialist International, in which Hashomer Hatzair saw the expression of reformism. Hashomer Hatzair rejected completely the idea of gradual transition from a capitalist to a socialist society, but felt itself close to the political socialistic trend of the Viennese socialist, especially as represented by Max Adler, finding in it a socialist vision which did not limit itself to, quote, formal democratic processes. And Wikipedia says Max Adler lived from 1873 to 1937. Max Adler was an Austrian jurist, political and social philosopher. Max Adler's theories were of central importance to Austro-Marxism. Max Adler was brother of Oscar Adler. to the text. This close alignment with Max Adler's policies did not nullify a rejection of Max Adler's philosophical methods and Max Adler's Kantian basis. During the 30s, Hashomer Hatzair attempted to align itself with the leftist non-communist branches of the socialist movement in Europe, but quickly abandoned the idea regarding them as too, quote, sectarian. Despite Hashomer Hatzair striving to identify the great process of worldwide socialist revolution, Hashomer Hatzair did not in the 1930s equate Marxism and socialism with the Soviet Union. Hashomer Hatzair appreciated her, quote, socialist constructive effort, end quote, but in no way avoided criticizing other aspects of Soviet society and politics. Elimination of the opposition in the Soviet Union and the Moscow trials merited strong condemnation. The USSR's joining of the League of Nations in 1934 and entering on the political scene drew criticism from both sides. Trotskyites within Hashomer Hatzair saw this as abandonment of the world revolution. Other trends criticized the Soviet Union's alienation from the democracies, and both denounced the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreements of August 1939, but were careful not to reject entirely the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat and the Soviet Union as its practical exponent. Despite the condemnation prevalent in Hashomer Hatzair over the German-Soviet agreements, Marxist explanation of the Second World War created severe political problems. Until June 1941, Hashomer Hatzair supported the anti-fascist war but kept its reservations towards the Western democracies. In April 1942, a conference was convened which rejected the Trotskyite trends and supported, quote, national fronts in the struggle against fascism. Criticism of the Soviet Union abated towards the end of the 1940s owing to the Soviet Union's role in the war against the Nazis, rescue of Jews, and support of the establishment of the State of Israel, which proved, as it were, that the Soviet Union was the historical interpretation of Marxism in the 40s. Section 15. The 30s and 40s brought new interpretations of Zionist Marxism, even outside the leftist Poale Zion and Hashomer Hatzair. Marxism became at that time a symbol of the active class struggle against capitalism and fascism. Counter-trends such as reformism of the humanistic socialism of demand were regarded as a surrender to fascism. A certain actuality was ascribed to adherence to Marxism within the Palestinian reality as well. This is not a return to the Marxism of the orthodox Poale Zion, which dissociated itself from constructivism and did not believe in its socialist value. Rather, it was an effort to show that constructive institutions, kibbutzim and the Histadrut, were part and parcel of the struggling working class. Hence, a renewed Marxism began to spread within the ranks of Mapai, the great Workers' Party, which had inherited its principles from Adut HaAvoda. It expressed itself in demands for, quote, class independence within Palestine and in feeling a kinship with the world revolution being led by the Soviet Union. Marxism declared a militant socialism and no compromising with the existing regimes. It was the symbol of the war against fascism within Palestinian reality. Zionist revisionists were seen to exemplify fascism. The demands for more equality among workers and for hegemony of the kibbutz movement were also presented in the capitalism and socialism. This was in opposition to the policies of the leaders Ben-Gurion and Katznelson, who sought the hegemony of the Workers' Party and the Zionist movement, as well as in the Jewish settlement in Palestine, although not by means of conquest of power or eliminating private enterprise. Leftist groups who were close to Marxism arose in the United Kibbutz, Kibbutz Ham Uehad movement, and in less well-to-do factions in the urban workers. In 1944, they split from Mapai. In the 1940s, the various factions of Marxist Zionism, the old as well as the new, became united, overcoming their historical differences of opinion. It was at this time that they assumed that Marxism would become a common denominator, even more relevant than, quote, constructivism, quote, pioneering, and, quote, class struggle, concepts which had divided them ever since the Bolshevik Revolution. The Soviet Union's war against the Nazis, and the Soviet Union's support of the creation of the State of Israel were understood as revolutionary socialism's recognition of Zionism. The Zionist struggle against the British was interpreted as anti-imperialist. The internal contradictions which arose in the Palestinian labor movement and increased with the development of the economy and emergence of the political dominance of labor on the national scene were seen as a struggle between revolutionary socialism and reformism. Section 16. The 50s changed scholastic formulae into fateful political platforms. Borochov's formulae of 1905-6 became the topic for concrete political debate. The right of nations to exist in the face of the world revolution, and the right to exist of the Jewish nation and the Jewish nation's separate state were made somehow dependent on the interpretation of theory. The right of Yugoslavia to differ with the Soviet Union, the right of Jews to immigrate to Israel, and the right of the Palestinian Jews to set up their own government were all put to the test. The meaning of Zionism as a worldwide movement and the existence of an independent Jewish society in Palestine were subjects for discussion in the light of Marxism as the practical expression of world revolution. In 1948, but a few months before the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, a huge, united and professedly Marxist Workers' Party was formed for the first time since 1919, MAPAM. Wikipedia says MAPAM was a left-wing political party in Israel. MAPAM is one of the antecedents of the Meretz Party and its successor, the Democrats. It says that its ideology was Labor Zionism, Marxism, Socialism, and Borochovism. MAPAM fulfilled an important political role during the first years of the State of Israel by voicing opposition to the government's internal and foreign policies as delineated by Ben-Gurion and Mapai. In the years 1948 to 52, the party became more and more leftist, and this expressed itself on the ideological plane by MAPAM's acceptance of Marxist doctrine. The resolutions adopted at MAPAM's Congress in May-June 1951 were the culmination of the doctrine's influence on any major Zionist political party. This was the orthodox Marxist interpretation of the early part of the century, transplanted into the historical context of the early 50s. The conference declared that the, quote, United Workers' Party is based upon Borochov's theory of a Marxist solution to the Jewish people's national problem, upon the Marxist-Leninist theory as a universal outlook and a course to be taken by revolutionary workers throughout the world in their political struggles, end quote. We may ask what the background was which equated realities with Marxist doctrine, and what meaning this doctrine had in 1951. Marxism in 1948 did not depend upon analysis of capitalism and the existing Palestinian proletariat. Marxism could not even rest, as Borochov's theory proposed, upon analysis of the development trends of the proletariat in the diaspora, since this no longer existed. The interpretation of Marxism under those conditions was the strategy of the World Socialist Revolution as it was understood against the background of international realities in 1948 to 52, the founding years of the State of Israel and the establishment of her internal and foreign policies. Marxist ideology was intended to explain international reality. In those years, it appeared that there were insurmountable contradictions between declining capitalism and rising socialism, and these could not be solved in a peaceful manner nor by agreement. Rather, they demanded universal and national class struggle. The Soviet Union stood at the center of the revolutionary struggle, and therefore revolutionary socialists would identify with her. Any workers' movement which was not revolutionary was accused of accepting the existing regime. However, the struggle against regimes had an additional meaning for Zionism. The freedom of the Jewish people and its, quote, territorial concentration, end quote, were part and parcel of the historical process. The support of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in the establishment of the state had an ideological significance. The sympathy and aid the revolutionary world gave to Zionism would only increase until there was complete reconciliation between the two, which would mean the immigration of Russian Jews to Israel and Israel's becoming a people's democracy. The kibbutz movement would emerge as the socio-economic leaders of the political socialist revolution. Parallel to this political orientation, Marxist doctrine became increasingly deeper rooted. It alone was thought to be, quote, scientific socialism. The Leninist interpretation of the ideology of Marx and Engels was accepted as the true interpretation of the revolutionary period, and non-Marxist socialism was accused of actually abandoning the class mission of the worker, both in Israeli and in international spheres. This brand of Marxism, which was dependent upon the international political situation, began to break down after a short time. Political and doctrinal conflicts started to appear as parallel phenomena. The first rift was in the interpretation of political and national problems in Palestine. Hashomer Hatzair indeed abandoned its idea of a binational state after the establishment of the State of Israel, although Hashomer Hatzair did consider restoration of the political unity of Palestine by the setting up of Jewish and Arab states which would be closely linked. This idea was not accepted by the Adat HaAvoda faction of Mapam, and in any case was not feasible. More practicable was the reception of Arabs into Mapam. Hashomer Hatzair supported this, but Adat HaAvoda found it to be a negation of the very essence of a Zionist party. However, the great test of loyalty to Zionism and the necessity to choose between Zionism and, quote, world revolution came in the field of international relations on the occasion of the Prague Trials, 1952, in which Mordecai Oren, a leader of Mapam, was accused of being an imperialist spy, and of the doctor's trial in Moscow in 1953. Mordecai Oren was a leader of Mapam and the kibbutz Artzi Hashomer Hatzair. Mordecai Oren was implicated in a scandal which created an uproar in the state of Israel during the early 50s when he was tried in a show trial in Eastern Europe and was dubbed a, quote, prisoner of Prague. Where am I? Prague Trials, 1952. So I'm looking up. The Slansky trial, which was officially titled Trial of the Leadership of the Anti-State Conspiracy Center headed by Rudolf Slansky, was a 1952 anti-Semitic show trial against 14 members of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, including many high-ranking officials. Several charges, including high treason, were announced against the group on the grounds of allegedly conspiring against the Czechoslovak Republic. General Secretary of the KSC, Rudolf Slansky, was the alleged leader of the conspirators. All 14 defendants were found guilty of crimes that they did not commit. 11 of them were sentenced to death and executed. The remaining 3 received life sentences. And I assume a lot of people know about the Doctor's Plot, but I'm just going to read the introduction from the Wikipedia real quick. The Doctor's Plot was a Soviet state-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign based on a conspiracy theory that alleged a cabal of prominent medical specialists, predominantly of Jewish ethnicity, intended to murder leading government and Communist Party officials. It was also known as the case of saboteur doctors or killer doctors. In 1951 to 1953, a group of mostly Jewish doctors from Moscow were accused of a conspiracy to assassinate Soviet leaders. This was later accompanied by publications of anti-Semitic character in the media which talked about the threats of Zionism and condemned people with Jewish surnames. Following this, many doctors, both Jews and non-Jews, were dismissed from their jobs, arrested, and tortured to produce admissions. A few weeks after Stalin's death in 1953, the new Soviet leadership said that there was a lack of evidence regarding the Doctor's Plot, and the case was dropped. Soon after, the case was declared to have been a fabrication. Back to the text. However, the great test of loyalty to Zionism and the necessity to choose between it and, quote, world revolution came in the field of international relations. On the occasions of the Prague trials in 1952, in which Mordecai Oren, a leader of Mapam, was accused of being an imperialist spy, and of the doctors' trials in Moscow. The former showed that the, quote, dual loyalties to Zionism and communism were incompatible. At the first stages, Mapam attempted to criticize the trials only from a Zionist and not from a general socialist viewpoint. The Prague trials challenged the ideological formula of, quote, equality of value, end quote, between Zionism and socialism as accepted by Mapam. The more leftist faction of Mapam, led by Moshe Snee, did not view it as an equality of value, but as the relation of a segment, Zionism, to a whole, world revolution. The priorities here are obvious. Moshe Snee was a Haganah commander and an Israeli politician, one of the founders of Mapam. He later joined the Israeli Communist Party, Maki. Back to the text. This controversy brought to the forefront the essence of the question of nationalities and the, quote, theory of stages. The definition of nationality as formulated by Borochov was greatly criticized by the extreme left, and it became necessary to adapt the doctrine of temporary national cooperation of the, quote, theory of stages to the circumstances of the 50s. Mapam's far-left faction under Moshe Snee expressed its extremist attitudes in both the political and doctrinal spheres. Politically, Snee protested against the right of Zionism, the state of Israel, or any other national movement to oppose world revolution led by the Soviet Union. Doctrinally, Snee protested against Borochovist theory, which since 1906 had legitimized the Marxist basis of Zionism and had been accepted by Hashomer Hatzair since 1927. Mapam's extreme left demanded the acceptance of the Stalinist definition of nationality, territory, language, economy, characteristics instead of the Borochovistic one, which recognized extraterritorial nations as well. Even though the extreme leftists were prepared to accept the Jewish anomaly as an exception, they refused to allow for the right of other nations to reject the Stalinist definition, and the control of the Soviet center, the Yugoslav example, was completely dismissed. Hashomer Hatzair and its leader, Meir Yaari, considered Snay's attitude as a symptom of Zionist liquidation and sliding into anti-Zionist communism. During the 50s, difficulties arose with respect to the, quote, theory of stages. When it was initially formulated in the 1920s, it seemed that the national solution of the, quote, ingathering of exiles, unquote, Jewish territorial concentration would precede the social world revolution. National cooperation was limited to the phase of integration and strengthening of the economy. During the 50s, however, it appeared that social revolution would precede the, quote, ingathering. Yaari, therefore, defined the third stage as the, quote, theory of stages. Yaari therefore defined the third stage of the, quote, theory of stages, stating that immigration to Israel would continue and not end with the social revolution. Zionism could therefore find legitimacy even within the socialist regime as the movement of the entire Jewish people, and not only by the right of self-determination of the Jews in Palestine. Just as the first wave of Marxism, which began in 1904, exploded over the Comintern's objection to Zionism in the 1920s, so the second wave, essentially that of Hashomer Hatzair, which began in 1927, exploded over the political realities of the 50s. During the mid-50s, revision of Mapam's adherence to Marxism-Leninism found expression in the theory of nationalities and was later applied to socialist ideology as a whole. The 20th Congress of the Communist Party, in criticism of Stalinism and of the Soviet policy in the Middle East and Hungary, as well as the attitude towards Jews in the Soviet Union, all brought about a more thorough revision of the 1951 stand when Mapam held its third Congress in 1958. Alignment with the, quote, world movement of revolutionary workers, end quote, which was not necessarily to be led by the Soviet Union, replaced the ties with the Soviet Union herself. The controversy appeared to be one of semantics. In the early 50s, Mapam had spoken of Marxism-Leninism as an indivisible whole. Now this unity dissolved and was not to be perceived as an indivisible entity. The Congress decided to, quote, devote all their energies to adapting Marxist and Leninist principles, the theoretical basis of international revolutionary socialism, to the present conditions of our people and country without being bound by dogmatic fetters, end quote. These decisions of the Congress do not indicate the entire process of change. In fact, there arose criticism of the whole theoretical structure of Hashomer Hatzair, that of the 20s and 30s. One section of Mapam demanded the abandonment of the idea of the, quote, proletarian dictatorship, end quote, which was an explicit attribute of revolutionary socialism, and adopting instead the doctrine of many courses leading to socialism. Thus, the concept which had been firmly implanted in Hashomer Hatzair in the later 20s and 30s had undergone a change. Activity within the framework of the existing regime was not restricted to one, quote, phase, the pre-revolutionary one, and did not necessarily have to be replaced by the seizing of power of the, quote, of the second, quote, phase. Economic and political activity within the existing regime could only further socialism. The discarding of the idea of realizing socialism through revolution eliminated the reasons for the existence of a vanguard party. Socialist parliamentary activity demanded a broad-based party, or at least participation in a government coalition. Indeed, Mapam began to become more and more involved in the Israeli political scene and finally joined an alignment with the Labor Party. The old guard of Mapam and its leader, Meir Yaari, still sought to fulfill Marxist ideas. In 1963, Yaari was prepared to abandon the Marxist notion of the, quote, theory of pauperization or the, quote, theory of crises, end quote. The flourishing of capitalist economies after the Second World War disproved them. Despite this, however, Yaari saw certain historical principles as being unchangeable. Yaari wished to preserve the intellectual foundation which would maintain within Mapam a secular and, quote, objective grasp of industry. This outlook would avoid the concept of higher power and, along with this, be free of skepticism with regard to possibilities for progress. Mapam might therefore remain loyal to, quote, historical and dialectical materialism, end quote. Mapam even ought to object to a capitalist regime because of its appropriating, quote, surplus values and the contradiction between it and technological progress. Yaari still thus desired to maintain not only his objections to capitalism, but also preserve the method of, quote, class struggle and even, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary phenomenon, end quote. Only two manifestations of the shortcomings of Marxism were recognized openly. Despite their devotion to internationalism, members of Mapam began to claim that Marxism did not develop a theory of nationalism. In addition, Marxism's treatment of agrarian problems was thought to be lacking. For Hashomer Hatzair, Marxism not only served as a guiding principle, but also supplied an intellectual pattern for a comprehensive ideology which was transmitted through kibbutz schools and youth movements. Relations between political attitudes and the intellectual world operated in both, quote, sorry, that's not a quote, that's a piece of dirt, operated in both directions. Conceptions consolidated attitudes, and attitudes became conceptions. Political orientation during the 60s, which found expression in renunciation of close ties with the Soviet Union and rejection of the course of revolutionary dictatorship, also manifested itself in intellectual change. Several factors caused this. Mapam's senior generation found it necessary to examine the ideological hypotheses of the 20s and whether they were to be blamed for the political misconceptions. The younger generation became indifferent and even antagonistic to Marxism. In a H.H. Kibbutz poll, only a small percentage of the population declared itself to be Marxist and Borochovists. A third reason for the renewed discussion of Marxist principles was the growing number of institutes of higher learning in the kibbutz movement, which gave a more theoretical character to ideological discussions. Despite the disappointment in Marxism as a political guide and the critical attitude of intellectuals, Mapam continued to adhere to Marxism as an ideological doctrine, believing that history and politics, without a systematic ideological outlook, would only lead to opportunism. The intellectual change in Marxism took several courses, one of which is a call to return to the, quote, original Marx. Marx's interpreters were accused of distorting his teachings by rendering them dry, sterile, and repellent to the public. Other trends found fault with conservative Marxism, decrying the absence of philosophical anthropology and Kantian elements, which would add absolute values to historical relativism. Such elements would be epistemological or ethical. In any case, they would prevent subjection to real or imaginary historical processes. Another criticism of the theoretical plane was that there did not develop a theory of nationalism analogous to the political theory. The lack of Marxist nationalist theory brought about the domination of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, according to this view, which also explained the relationship of the Soviet Union to Zionism. In these examinations, Hashomer Hatzair and Mapam voiced criticism regarding the traditional hypotheses of Marxism, such as recurring crises in capitalist society, the form revolution would take, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, abolishment of private property through nationalization as the fundamental principle, bringing about a total change which would ensure the creation of a better society. The Soviet Union was presented as an etatist society ruled by a bureaucracy, a regime which was held responsible for the outrages of Soviet policy. Hashomer Hatzair remained faithful to Hashomer Hatzair's initial Marxist concept of the relationship between the, quote, foundation and superstructure. It saw the basic flaw in Soviet society as the contradiction between a nationalized economy and one administered by the workers themselves. A society autonomously administering its own production could be free of the shortcomings warping the Soviet Union's internal and foreign policies. New section, summary. The widespread acceptance of Marxism by consecutive generations of Zionists is surprising for a number of reasons. The conditions for the development of capitalism and of the working class in Palestine were either entirely different from those prevalent in Russia and Galicia, or at best only partially similar. On the other hand, Marxism spread great confusion among Zionists who accepted it only after long-winded polemics. Nevertheless, there are important values which Marxism imparted to Zionism, such as the territorial principle of nationalism, historical determinism, analysis of the Jewish economic structure, the possibility of harmony between Zionism and universal class war, and solidarity among the people living in Palestine. Marxism was one of the factors that assembled and consolidated the workers as a separate body within the Zionist movement, even though, as mentioned above, the tendency towards unity in the labor movement opposed doctrinaire Marxism. The negation of private property during the realization of Zionism was justified on either Zionist or on moral and not on Marxist grounds, but the influence of Marxism still remained powerful. Marxism raised great difficulties for Zionism in that Marxism placed strong emphasis on class distinctions among the Jewish people during the national effort and on the potential schism between Jewish loyalty and class or international proletarian loyalty. Marxist Zionists attempted to dissolve this conflict of loyalties by means of the theory of, quote, division into stages. Borochov differentiated between the stage of building a capitalist economy in which there is a spontaneous partnership among the classes and the stage of struggle for national and class emancipation led by the proletariat. Hashomer Hatzair differentiated between the stage of national construction and the stage of revolution in which the national interclass partnership would come to an end. These, quote, stages were found unsuitable to political behavior and were accused of causing a division of loyalties. One characteristic phenomenon of Zionist Marxism from 1920 was the identification of the majority of Zionist Marxists with the dictatorship of the proletariat and the acceptance of the Bolshevik interpretation of Marxism over a reformist or orthodox one. Zionist Marxism was also generally associated with the avant-garde type of ideological party rather than with a wide class party. In addition, the constant attachment of Palestinian Marxism to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the Soviet Union linked its ideology to the changing political relations between Zionism and communism, relations which generally could be characterized as sharply antagonistic. Zionist Marxism was more the theory of an intelligentsia which endeavored to lead the Jewish labor class than a theory of the Jewish working class itself. This class as it existed in Eastern Europe and insofar as it maintained a Jewish Marxist ideology followed the lead of the Bund. The Zionist Marxist intelligentsia did not succeed in directing the Jewish working class in Eastern Europe or in America and in bringing it to Palestine. Nevertheless, Marxist ideology had become one of the motivations for building a national economy in Palestine and Israel and for establishing a Jewish working class there, as well as an impetus for workers' hegemony in the national life in general. The weakness of Jewish capitalism in Palestine and the lack of a national state prevented the adoption of the conventional, quote, class struggle by the Jewish working class there, even when this formula was used with connotations different from those in European Marxism. Labor economy in Palestine was usually not judged by Marxist criteria. It was tested by its national economic and moral value more than by its capacity to undermine capitalism. The discrepancy between Marxism and the Jewish social reality in Palestine and the difficulties that arose lead us to seek psychological motives for Marxism's acceptance. They can be found in the quest for concepts of social analysis and the wish to localize the social ideal in a materialist reality, in the orientation of the historical process, and in the striving for a coherent ideology and political universe. Marxism's power was manifested in the historical status Marxism gave the proletariat. In the case of Palestine, this was not an existing proletariat, but a proletariat which developed voluntarily due to the needs of the Palestinian economy and Zionist labor ideals. The concept of the national pioneer found its intellectual and social counterpart in the mission envisaged for the working class by Marxism. Recognition of this mission made it possible to demand the consolidation of the working class in Palestine and Israel. This class was, in fact, greatly variegated, comprising laborers and settlers, members of cooperatives, and self-employed workers. Marxism's intellectual impact can best be illustrated by the vacuum it has left in the intellectual and public spheres over the past few years, now that its influence has decreased. Marxism, which had permeated Jewish society in Eastern Europe, faces today a completely different situation. The geographical distribution and class structure of the Jewish people have changed radically. Jewish unity, the trends in Jewish society, and the place of Israel in the life of the Jewish people cannot be formulated in the Borochovist Marxist terms of the beginning of the century. The social reality of Israel and Israel's intellectual life pose new problems for Marxist Zionism. Some of these problems are common to all developed societies, and some are peculiar to Israel. Marxism is no longer considered a valid theory for the explanation of social reality. Concentration of capital, pauperization, and social polarization, crisis and revolution are not relevant descriptions of the social process. Dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be adopted as a revolutionary strategy under the present class structure, pluralist society, and democratic state. Obedience to the Soviet Union is rejected for both Zionist and socialist reasons. From the intellectual point of view, Marxism can no longer be considered as the only, quote, scientific method for the interpretation of social reality. The free and pluralistic intellectual life does not permit the dogmatism that was prevalent in Eastern and Central Europe at the beginning of the century. In spite of the collapse of the traditional Marxist Zionist theories during the 1960s, and in spite of the radical changes in world and Jewish situations, one cannot claim that Marxism in Israel is intellectually dead. Of course, it is no longer considered a guide to the interpretation of history as a national or international Of course, Marxism is no longer considered a guide to the interpretation of history as a national or international class struggle. It has lost its appeal as a revolutionary strategy. However, Marxism still maintains its appeal as a comprehensive philosophy of man and society. Marxism is considered of value as a theory which attempts to achieve the philosophical ideal of a free and rational individual in the economic and social reality. Marxism is considered a critique of the market economy and the culture of consumption. In a modified form, Marxism can serve for an analysis of Israel's economy and society. The existence of the kibbutz movement in Israel is a formidable factor which attributes significance to Marxism as an ideal of a socialist society. The end. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for listening to me look things up that I was ignorant of. Hopefully that was helpful to you as well. Thank you so much for listening.